We have a number of presenters, and should be an exciting morning. And we have, and then at lunch, we have Kazen that will sponsor our lunch. We have another, I think, Gulf Coast Task Force has another section. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? And that's coming up on the 21st?
Wednesday.
Wednesday, the 21st?
Yeah, TA over there and Phil discussed various topics. An email went out to most members of Gulf Coast
Task Force.
So if you're interested and didn't get the email, let me know and I'll be happy to add you to the list.
It was talk about just a number of issues dealing with indirect costs to
Auditor changes.
yeah, administrative
banking
rules and changes that have been coming out recently. Kind of you get a strange email from TA when there's an administrative rule change, and sometimes they have to change it or update it every time, and so you get a change in auditors about filing for depository contracts, and you're like wondering where is this coming from and why in the middle of the summer. So we will get an update on the 21st on that. Our next meeting is going to be on February, let's say it's the 11th, if I'm not mistaken. I'm having a couple of book authors that are going to come in, similar to Hipólito, that wrote similar books, so we'll have a couple of people like that coming in. We do have the iPads out there, so if you need an iPad, they're in the back, and you can just check them out so you can kind of follow on the detail. Let's see what else. Well, let me ask you, I haven't usually, I'm kind of finishing out February's agenda. March is still tentative. April is everything about bonds and selling bonds and everything, rating and everything on bonds. But are there any, let me take a few minutes to ask you guys, are there any, what are some specific topics that you would like to see coming up in the later on in spring and the summer? I usually go back to some of the ones that we've had in the past and bring in updates on purchasing, auditing, accounting, and budgeting and things like that. But is there a specific topic or specific issue that, we need a speaker on MOE, special ed, or something like that? I need to know from you guys. Send me an email and suggest so I can try to seek out speakers. We're glad that Mike is here, but sometimes other arms of TEA are not as available, and so sometimes I really need to go through the ladder there to try to find some folks there. But so hopefully we can get that. I'll have a requesting to Corey Green to hopefully we can get a more detailed discussion on the uniform grant guidance that's coming out. We already had a few of those already a couple months ago, but you can never get enough about grants, right? There's always something going on there, so we can have another one from them. So do let me know if there's any particular topic that you're really interested in, that you want me to bring in a speaker just to talk about that particular area. Now, some of you are probably going to do, who's going to be needing to do depository RFPs this summer? Usually we have somebody that comes in to talk to you from a bank to kind of see what kind of RFPs and what kind of issues need to be included in the RFP. And of course, TA has the guidance, but it's always so good to hear from the bank's perspective as to how they look at the RFPs. Let me introduce you to Ernie Davis. He's with the ExxonMobil Chemical. He's a supervisor for, I hope I pronounce it right, Global Gas Phase Polyethylene Process Technology. And he's been with us for about, now I think it's like his third year, I think, with being with us, updating us on the outlook and forecast of energy into 2040. So he's glad to, we're glad that you're here and you know, come and talk to us about this important topic, and you know, thank you for being here. And so please help me welcome Ernie Davis.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jesus, for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to come speak to you again. I think it is my third year coming here. I know last year I also talked about ExxonMobil's outlook for energy, and happy to be here again to do it today. As Jesus noted, my name is Ernie Davis. I've been with ExxonMobil for 22 years. Currently, I'm working in the chemical portion of our business, and I'll be the first to admit up front that I am not an oil and gas expert. But the intent today here is not to bring in an expert or high-level CEO. It's just to bring in an everyday person. I use energy day in and day out, just like you do. To talk to you about a very important study that ExxonMobil does annually, and that's our outlook for energy. We do it annually. We've been doing it for many years. We used to use it solely internally. Now we share it with politicians and industry leaders and energy consumers such as yourself, wherever we get the opportunity to do so. The outlook focuses on future customers. Our intent with this study is every year we bring together a group of economists, engineers, and scientists within ExxonMobil to take a look at who the future customers of energy are going to be. Where are they at in the world? What are their standards of living? What are their energy requirements going to be? And by taking a look at how technology is expected to evolve over the next 20 to 30 years, try to predict what types of energy will be needed, in what quantities they'll be needed, and where in the world that they'll be used. This outlook is strongly dependent upon the decisions that individuals and nations make about what types of energy they use, so it is a prediction. But it's one that we take very seriously. In fact, we utilize this study to help guide the multi-billion-dollar investment decisions that we make day in and day out on what projects to produce. I've got a stack of notes here. I'm going to apologize in advance, but our energy outlook comes out in December, and so I'm presenting the latest and greatest version. It's only a couple weeks old, and so to ensure that I don't mess up on the numbers, I've got a small stack of papers here to help me along. So I hope that doesn't cause too much of a distraction. The energy outlook that we develop is we do it from a bottoms-up approach. We do it by taking a look at 100 countries around the world and breaking each of those countries down and taking a look at 15 different energy demand sectors within each of the countries, as well as the 20 different types of fuel that are used to meet those energy demands. And then we project where we expect economies for these countries to go, population trends, standards of living trends, as well as technology trends when it comes to the type of fuels that will be economic to produce between now and 2040. While the outlook is unique to ExxonMobil, it's an ExxonMobil produced product, I think the themes and the projections that we develop are quite consistent with other energy advising organizations such as the International Energy Agency, as well as the United States Energy Information Administration. So as we get into the outlook and talk about energy, I'd like to utilize this chart to provide some perspective on energy measures in units. I'll start by taking a look, we'll start with taking the most basic look at energy, the very first use of energy by humans, and that's fire. Just bear with me here. We're going to try to build this up to kind of put this into perspective. You could say that this is the that you could say that the most basic unit of energy is that's contained in the logs that are used to build that fire. So one log of wood. The energy contained in that one log of wood can be translated into British thermal units, or BTUs, which is a more modern convention of energy measurement. If you shop for air conditioner, you've probably encountered the BTU before, how many BTUs your air conditioner puts out. So a log contains about a little over 24,000 BTUs. A more familiar form of energy that you're probably familiar with, if you stopped at the gas station on the way to today's meeting, is the gallon of gasoline. Well, a gallon of gasoline has the energy equivalent of about 5 logs, or about 125,000 BTUs. Now let's look at, but another form of energy you're very familiar with, not only gallons of gasoline, but electricity. You paid your electric bill this month, you know you pay for electricity in kilowatt hours. A gallon of gasoline is equivalent to about 36 kilowatt hours of energy. And if you want to break it down, that's equivalent to about 13,000 AA batteries, or 4,000 of the batteries in your smartphone. So this is just to give you an idea that energy can be measured in a number of different ways, whether it's logs, BTUs, or kilowatt hours, or gallons of gasoline. So let's take a look at what the typical person in the United States requires from an energy perspective for their life in a typical day. So just running your household, particularly electricity, maybe natural gas for heat, just running your house, you consume about 7 logs of energy. Driving around each day in your cars, the typical U.S. person consumes about 6 or demands 6 logs of energy. Industry, to make all of the things that we need, the clothes we wear, the gasoline we put in our cars, furniture, all of the things that we consume. Industry is about 11 logs per day. And then there's commercial transportation, so all of those things that industry is producing in order to get them to the supermarkets, the malls, and to your house. Commercial transportation demands about 4 logs of energy a day. And then lastly, commercial buildings, so all of the offices, schools, hospitals, all of those commercial buildings, just like the one here today, that we're in today, that's consuming energy to heat, light. Commercial buildings are another 6 logs. So that's a total of about 34 logs a day per person, which is the equivalent to about 7 gallons of gasoline. Now note, this is a person in the United States. So a U.S. person consumes the equivalent of about 7 gallons of gasoline of energy. But now let's take a look at that on a global basis, not just the United States. It's interesting to note that in the United States we consume a significant amount more energy than the rest of the world. In fact, on average, if you look at the entire world, on average, a person only consumes about 1.7 gallons of gasoline equivalent energy, as opposed to 7 in the United States. But you have to take into account that there's currently 7 billion people in the world. And so that equates to 12 billion gallons of gasoline a day of energy equivalent. And that's why this energy outlook is very important, because in the energy industry, that's what we're all about, is how to find, develop, and deliver the equivalent of 12 billion gallons of gasoline every single day, to do it reliably and to do it safely. Now, in the oil industry, oil and gas industry, we typically don't talk about gallons, we don't talk about logs. We typically talk about MBDOE, which is million barrels a day of oil equivalent. So this 12 billion gallons translates into about 260 million barrels a day of oil equivalent, because not all energy is oil. Another way we look at it is quads. This is a huge amount of energy. When we say quads, we're talking about quadrillion BTUs. We shorten it down to just quads. So this is the equivalent. The world consumes and demands 525 quadrillion BTUs a day. It's a huge, huge industry. And that energy is satisfied through a multitude of different types of energy sources, and we'll talk about that more detail later. All right, so let's take a look at just a top-level summary of how much energy the world will need in 2040. And we'll look at two main drivers for energy demand, particularly population growth and economic activity. So we expect, as you can see on the left-hand chart, we expect the world's population to grow from roughly 7 billion today to about 9 billion people by the year 2040. And we expect the gross domestic product, measured in trillions of 2010 dollars, to grow by about 140% for the world. Now let's look at energy demand to meet that population growth and economic growth. We expect energy demand to only grow by about 35%. Now this is pretty interesting, and you might note, well, how do those two line up? Significant growth in population, a huge growth in economic activity, and yet only a 35% rise in energy demand. And that's primarily because of efficiency. Not only are we going to be needing more energy, in the future, in the coming years, we're going to consume that energy more efficiently. And you can see here that if we didn't factor in expected gains in energy efficiency, this line would show where energy requirement would really go. In fact, this is the amount of energy that's being saved under that curve is quite significant. And you might even say that efficiency is the largest source of energy that will be required to meet the world's energy demand in the future. Now, to examine this in a little more detail, we break these up into, we're going to break these charts up into different regions of the world. And for our energy outlook, we break them into 5 different groups. At the bottom in the blue, you've got the OECD, which is essentially the United States, Europe, Australia, okay? And for our study, we exclude Mexico and Turkey, and because even though they're part of the OECD, we actually lump them in with the key growth. So you got the OECD at the bottom, you have China, and then India, and then what we call the key growth group. These are 10 countries that we think will have a significant gain in population, significant gain in GDP, and more importantly, a significant effect on energy demand. These countries include Brazil, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, South Africa, Thailand, Egypt, and Turkey. Now, with these slices, you can see some pretty dramatic trends. In particular, if you look at the blue, the United States and Europe, you'll notice that our population remains relatively flat. Our GDP grows quite nicely, but on the right-hand side, you'll notice almost no growth in energy demand. And this is actually quite remarkable. I mean, we're expecting that the economies in the United States and Europe to continue to grow at a very nice rate, but due to increased efficiencies, not only what's being mandated by government, but also what's being required or requested by consumers, through efficiency, there will be almost no increase in energy within the United States and Europe. You'll see a very significant increase in energy demand in China and in the key growth countries. And what this really, the main message of this chart, the key thing to take away from this is Between now and 2040, we expect all increased demand for energy to come from the developing world, not from the developed countries of the world. Now, another key component, we look at GDP, the rise in GDP, but that doesn't tell the whole story. A very important component is standards of living. Between now and 2040, we see a significant increase in the standards of living of people around the world. I'll note the pictures on the right. Well, first, let me finish the chart on the left. So you see the standards of living in OECD and China rising quite dramatically, even in India and the key growth countries. I mean, across the world, there will be increasing portions of the population moving out of poverty and into what we call middle class. And we'll talk a bit more about that in more detail in a couple of slides. But on the right-hand side, when we talk about standards of living, we're talking about people, changing the fuel they use to cook their meals, going from manual labor to utilizing machinery to do farming, as well as gaining access to electricity. I've given this speech several times to a number of different groups, and a couple of statistics that I find very fascinating and I think audiences don't always really appreciate. Despite how modern our world is, there's still 2.7 billion of the 7 billion people in the world that have no access to modern cooking fuel. They're still cooking fuel with basically, logs, trees, branches, that sort of thing. They don't have modern cooking fuels. And interestingly enough, out of the 7 billion people in the world, 1.3 billion of the people of the world today still have no access to electricity. So I talked about middle class. We expect the middle class to continue to grow. When we talk about middle class, we're talking about people who have enough, their income level is beyond the minimum income threshold. In other words, they have enough income to satisfy their basic needs and then have some level of discretionary income left over for discretionary spending. And it's the middle class with that discretionary spending power that drives the demand for cars, electric appliances, computers, smart cell phones, and so forth. And that's what drives energy demand. So you can see here, today the middle class, out of the 7 billion people in the world, the middle class is represented by only about 2 billion people. And it's expected to increase quite significantly to nearly 5 billion people by 2030. In fact, we expect the next 15 years to be an historic period of prosperity for the world, a very prosperous period of time that we don't think the world has seen before. The OECD only accounts for about half of that middle class population. And as you can see, when you compare 2010 to 2030, almost all of the increase in people moving out of poverty or below the poverty line and into the middle class is outside of the OECD. India will add about 1.1 billion people to the middle class. China will add about 0.9 billion to the middle class. And these are the two largest groups representing. So these two countries alone, a significant number of people, over 2 billion people just in these two countries between now and 2030 will move into the middle class. And that will drive a significant demand for cars, electric appliances, and so forth, as they have discretionary income and gain access to the modern conveniences that we enjoy today. And then you have the key growth countries which are expected to double their numbers of middle class, and they represent over 80% of the growth. So I talked about how we break down our energy outlook. We look at supply and demand in 4 key sectors. On the demand side, we'll take a look at 4 different categories: transportation, residential, commercial, industrial, and electricity generation. Now, transportation in green we see that the demand for energy within the transportation sector increasing by about 40%. And this is probably the sector that's most familiar to you, driving your cars every day. This is closely linked to the consumer. But in reality, electricity power generation in the red on the left it's not only the largest sector, but it's also the sector that's going to grow the most. And so as we talk about energy demand in the next few slides, pay particular attention to what's happening in the electricity power generation sector, as it will have the most significant impact on total energy demand. Now here's that same chart, but I've sliced it between the OECD and the rest of the world, between the blue and the red. And this tells the same stories we talked about earlier. You see that energy demand across all four sectors remain relatively flat within the United States and Europe and Australia, whereas the rest of the world is where all of the growth is. So now we'll go through these four sectors, starting with transportation first. And when I talk transportation, I alluded to your cars, a minute ago, but I'm not talking just cars. I'm talking cars and trucks, so the total transportation sector. So transportation will grow. The fuel or energy required by the transportation sector will grow about 40% over the outlook period. At the bottom, you'll notice light duty, which are your cars. Light duty vehicle energy demand will peak at about 23 million barrels of oil, and then it'll be relatively flat, if not starting to taper off. Heavy duty vehicle demand, which is in the center there, which are your large commercial trucks on the road, they will take over light duty vehicles as the top spot, the number one consumer of transportation fuels by about 2030. And by 2040, the commercial trucks will represent about 40% of the total transportation energy demand. We also include aviation, marine, and rail. They make up about a third of the transportation sector demand, but not a lot of movement over the outlook period. So let's take a look at light duty fleet and demand. Light duty cars. We expect the number of cars in the world to double, adding about 900 million cars to the roads, mostly in the developing world between now and 2040. China alone we expect, will have 400 million cars on their roads by 2040. And so this is what drives the demand for energy. You can see, is this on? You can see there's growth in the OECD, but due to improved standards of living, China goes significant growth over the outlook period. Now on the right side, we take a look at demand for light-duty transportation fuels. And you'll notice that, as we noted earlier, the demand is quite flat. Partly there is some growth of population, due to population, and growth due to standards of living. And if it weren't for increasing fuel efficiency of the cars being produced, this is where energy demand for light-duty vehicles would be. But due to government mandates on how fuel efficient the cars are being produced today, you'll see that the demand will continue to rise until pretty close to 2018, 2019, and then we expect it to be relatively flat as the number of miles per gallon of today's cars increase. And so that begs a question, and a question we get a lot is, what cars do we think we'll be driving in the future? And we actually have to take this into account as we do our energy outlook. So what is the car of the future? Well, at ExxonMobil, in our energy outlook, we believe that the dominant car in the future will be what we call the full hybrid. Okay? Now that's different from an electric, plug-in, or fuel cell car. The full hybrid is the Toyota Prius, as an example. It's a car that combines a conventional internal combustion gasoline engine with an electric motor and battery. And it really offers consumers the best of both worlds. It's very efficient. The electrical motor and battery, it's very efficient. It's lots of miles per gallon. But because it's got an onboard internal combustion engine, it still can drive roughly the same range, 300 to 500 miles on a tank of gas, and it doesn't. And it still has the performance that you expect when you get behind a gasoline engine. There will be some growth in electric and plug-ins, but due to their limits on how far they can drive, we don't think that growth will be as significant as the full hybrid. And you can see though, as the full hybrids come in, you'll see that the number of cars, gasoline, your standard gasoline car will peak around 2030 and will start to taper off. Now we include natural gas in here as well. You can power a car with natural gas. As we'll talk about in the next slide when we talk about heavy transportation, we see natural gas being much more economic when it comes to commercial trucks as opposed to cars, just due to the cost and infrastructure and the economics. Natural gas is really more attractive for heavy duty than it is for light duty vehicles. So I said we would talk about heavy duty, commercial trucks, significant increase in energy demand over the outlook period, an increase of about 65%. And this, I think this it's not that hard to understand. We talked about growing GDP, we talked about increasing numbers of people moving into the middle class, having discretionary spending, and wanting to purchase more discretionary goods. Well, as there's more demand for those goods, you have to produce those goods, which means you have to truck them. You have to get them from the point of manufacture to the consumer. And so it's that growth in the middle class, the growth in the population, and the growth in GDP that's going to drive significant demand in heavy-duty transportation fuel. If we break down that fuel into the various types of fuel, you'll see that diesel makes up about 80% of the growth in heavy-duty. And I talked about natural gas, and you can see here that natural gas is growing somewhat rapidly. It's starting to emerge as a fairly significant fuel. In fact, and by 2040, we expect about 10% of the commercial fleets to be utilizing natural gas. You've already seen this. I think I can never remember if it's UPS or FedEx, but one of those two delivery companies has been touting that they're converting their whole fleet of delivery trucks to natural gas. I live and work in Baytown, and there's a very large commercial truck stop at Baytown, in Baytown, and a lot of trucks stop off there before they make the journey through Houston. And at that large gas station, they've installed natural gas fueling. And so increasing number of those heavy-duty commercial trucks are now utilizing natural gas instead of diesel. So we will continue to see the increase in the use of natural gas in the heavy-duty transportation sector. So next, let's talk about the industrial sector. And I don't have a whole lot of detail here, but the industrial sector today amounts for about 30% of the world's energy consumption, and total industrial demand will rise by about 40%. And the bulk of that, vast majority of that, about 85% of that increase will be in chemicals. And if you've been anywhere along the ship channel, the east side of Houston, you can see this in play already. Lots of chemical plants under construction, our company included, but there are a number of companies that are expanding the chemical industry right now due to the access to low-cost feedstocks brought about by the shale gas revolution. So chemicals will be a significant growth area. Heavy industries such as steel, automotives, and textiles. And then the actual energy industry. So in order to produce energy and bring energy to the consumer, it takes energy to make that happen. and then other. Some energy gets converted into agriculture, lubricants, and asphalt. Next, I'd like to talk about, you recall when I was talking about the 4 demand sectors, we talked about how electricity power generation was the largest and sector, and the sector that we expect to grow the most. And so these next few slides are really the heart of the demand side of our outlook. So if you look at the growth of electricity demand, we expect the world will need about 85% more electricity than we do today. And if you break that down into what's driving that expansion, you'll notice that the base demand is actually declining. But due to growth in the industrial area, some due to population growth, but primarily by improved standards of living. This is what's really driving the need for electricity into the future. And on the right-hand side, we take a look at electricity demand by region. You'll note that 2014, when we did the study in the dashed line right there in the middle, a couple of key observations. You'll see the rapid increase in the amount of electricity needed and demanded in China. In fact, as of 2014, China has now surpassed the United States in the amount of electricity that it demands. And it's already about halfway to the amount of electricity it'll need in 2040. And it's quite phenomenal when you look out here at 2040, how much electricity is required or demanded in China versus the rest of the world. Now, as the world needs almost twice as much power generation by the year 2040, I'm going to take a look at the types of fuels that needed to produce that electricity. And there's a range of different factors to consider when power companies are trying to decide how they're going to produce that electricity. So you can see across the top, some of the key fuel choices that are available today. Coal, new technology, coal with carbon capture, natural gas, nuclear, wind, and then solar. For the sake of time, I don't want to talk about all of the various choices that go into picking. I'd like to focus on three. And in the three I'd like to focus on are the economics, or the cost, the CO2 emissions, and then the availability of the fuel. Now in the public domain, a lot of times we just talk about these three choices one at a time. So you'll hear people talk about the cost of natural gas versus coal, or the cost of nuclear, or you'll hear people talk about the emissions that come from all of these choices. But in reality, power companies take into account all three of these in making a decision what type of power plant to build. On the economics, I'm sorry, let me set the basics a little bit. So you can see what we've done is we've taken a look at, full green circle is most favorable and yellow is less favorable. So you can see when it comes to economics or cost, coal and natural gas are the clear winners. By using coal or natural gas, you're able to produce electricity at the lowest possible price compared to the others. When you look at emissions, obviously coal is the least favorable fuel source, while solar, wind, and nuclear are clearly the winners when it comes to the amount of CO2 generated to produce a kilowatt hour of electricity. And then lastly, on availability. And availability is taking into account the fact that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. So you have to take, so while these two choices are quite good for emissions, they're not always available. You want electricity, we as consumers want electricity 24/7. And so in the heat of a Texas summer, the sun might be out, but the wind might not always be blowing when it's 100 degrees outside. So electricity producers have to take all three of these into consideration. And when you look at these three factors across all of these fuel choices, it's pretty clear why we're seeing such a huge growth in natural gas-fired electricity power generation plants. it strikes pretty much, it strikes a very good balance between cost of the electricity to produce, its availability, and by availability, take into account that natural gas can easily be piped from one location to another via underground pipeline. And while it's not as environmentally clean as wind and solar, it has about half the CO2 emissions of coal, and it has the added advantage that with a natural gas powered power plant, you can increase production of electricity, decrease production of electricity as needed, but you can, more importantly, you can produce electricity 24/7, something you can't do with wind and solar. So to conclude the power discussion, we'll take a look at global power demand in the various sectors. And the mix of fuel in each of the regions will vary widely. So if you look in the OECD, you'll see the growth of natural gas use for power generation and a significant decrease in the amount of coal. There is also some increase in nuclear and a fairly sizable increase in wind and solar. Whereas in China will continue to fuel a significant amount of their electricity production with coal. However, even in China, we expect later in the period after 2030 that the amount of coal will start to give way to some additional gas production and nuclear production. India will continue to power their electricity generation primarily with coal. The key growth countries, increases in primarily natural gas, and the rest of the world also with natural gas. So we'll wrap up our demand discussion with this slide. What this slide is showing you is each of the major fuel sources and how much demand we believe there will be for each of these fuel sources by 2040. The dashed lines in the middle of the bars represent what the demand was for that fuel source back in 2010. And so as you can see from this chart, oil will remain the number one fuel, or the largest fuel, even in 2040. And that's primarily because of transportation. It's a liquid, it's easy to transport, the infrastructure is already in place. And so oil will continue to be number one, but you can see its growth rate is a little bit less than 1%. Whereas natural gas will grow about double the pace. So the demand for natural gas will increase and it'll overtake coal by about 2025, I believe. It will overtake coal as the number 2 fuel source for global energy, and it will be growing quite rapidly. Whereas coal is pretty much at a standstill. While some portions of the world will continue to increase coal, such as China and India, the OECD countries are at the same time reducing their coal usage. And so there's almost no growth in the amount of coal used to generate energy. Biomass will continue to grow. And out here you'll see renewables, such as solar, wind, and biofuels. They will have the largest growth rate. I mean, almost a 6% growth rate, 6 times the growth of oil. However, they're starting at a very low base. And so while they're growing very rapidly, even by 2040, they'll still be a fairly small player in the global energy demand. But I mean, this may change, as we continue to do our energy outlook and look past 2040. This growth rate, wind, solar, biofuels, may start to move a little bit more to the left.
Ernie,
Yes.
recent, news talk about the administration's focus on that sector,
Mm-hmm.
but yet it doesn't seem to be a big player going forward. So why such a big emphasis and looking at so much tax credits and things of that sort? Since it's not going to be even if it doubles, it's not going to make a big impact.
Well, I think that the goal of the government's goal is to provide incentives for people to enter this industry to produce these types of power, because they do, you know, on the previous slide where we're looking at what fuel choices electricity generators have to choose from. From an environmental perspective, these fuel sources do have the lowest impact on the environment. But, you know, they're still met by some hurdles. I mean, there's still, you know, people aren't too thrilled about having wind turbines in their backyard, or, you know, large solar collection fields, you know, just outside their town. So, I mean, they do still have their hurdles. But the reason for the tax subsidies to encourage this industry is driven by environment. Yeah, if it weren't for those tax subsidies, this would be a very expensive form of energy. Primarily because it's not available 24/7. So we've touched on CO2 emissions, and that was a great question as a lead into. As part of our energy outlook, we also take a look at where we think world emissions are going to go over the outlook period. This chart, you can see, we believe CO2 emissions will peak around 2030 and then actually start to tail off. This is actually a pretty impressive claim when you take into account the growth in population, the growth in GDP, and the growth in energy demand. We're still predicting that even though energy consumption will go up significantly, emissions will actually hit a peak and start declining. And here we've broken it down by region. So you can see in the OECD, US and Europe, CO2 emissions are already declining and will continue to do so throughout the outlook period. China will continue to increase in CO2 emissions as they increase electricity production, primarily fueled with coal. But then as they start to convert from coal over to natural gas, later in the outlook period, their emissions will also start to drop. Now this is CO2 emissions by region, and talking about emissions wouldn't be complete without taking a look at the emissions per capita. This is the CO2 emissions per person in tons per person. Remember, we said all of the energy demand was primarily going to be in the developing world. Energy demand within the US and Europe was going to be relatively flat. So as our population grows, our energy consumption is flat, you know, emissions per person, because of converting from coal to natural gas, as well as becoming more efficient in our use of energy, emissions per person will decrease. And emissions per person outside of the OECD will increase as well, or will increase. But you can see that even in the developing world, even after a significant economic expansion and increase in energy demand, the amount of CO2 emissions per person is still about half of what it is in the US and Europe. So we've talked about demand. When you look at supplying meeting that demand, you have to take into account supply. So far we've analyzed how many people there are going to be, what are their standards of living going to be, how much energy they're going to need. Well, in the energy industry, the industry that ExxonMobil is in, we focus on how are we going to supply that energy. So if you take a look at liquid supply, we expect total liquid supply to rise by about 30% over the outlook period, and will reach about 115 million barrels a day by 2040. Of these expanding supplies, natural gas liquids, shown here in red, will be the type of liquid that grows the most and will make up the largest supply increase. And they'll grow to about 6 million barrels a day. Tight oil increases, oil sands, deep water. Now if you look at the bottom, the dark green, conventional, crude, and condensate. I want to highlight one thing. When energy companies go out and develop an oil field, a conventional oil field, they find that conventional means somewhere on land you locate oil and you drill a well and you start producing oil. That's a conventional oil well. If we didn't do any technology development, the amount of supply coming from those conventional oil wells would actually be decreasing. And so the business that we're in is finding new additional conventional oil deposits to develop, as well as the technology required to get access to them. And so in order to keep this relatively flat requires a significant amount of investment. Another question we often get, and it's all, you hear about it in the press, is, well, how much oil is there? Are we at peak oil? Are we going to run out of oil? I find this chart pretty interesting. What this shows is what we had documented as recoverable resource estimates for various years. So back in 1981, we thought there was only about 2 trillion barrels of oil that could be recovered left. By 1990, that had increased a bit, and by 2000, that had increased a bit more. What's really interesting is in the last 13 years, there's been a significant, almost 50% increase in the amount of recoverable barrels of oil that we believe is out there. And that is all because of technology development. By expending money on research and development and developing new technologies to be able to get access to oil that couldn't be accessed with the technology we had back in 1980, we've significantly increased the world's reserves in oil. Now, if you pull out your calculators and crunch the numbers, this 6 trillion barrels of oil will last the world approximately 100 years. And that's today. 10 years from now, we'll develop even newer technologies that get access to even more oil deposits, and this number will change again. But even today, we believe that we've identified enough oil resources to last the world for 100 years, just on today's technology. So let's take a look at liquids trade balance by region. When I presented this talk last year, I think these next few slides were quite interesting, and the story this year really hasn't changed. The dashed lines show you for North America the demand for liquids, oil, or natural gas liquids. So for 2010, 2020, 2030, 2040, you see it's relatively flat. Now we build up the supply that's available that's going to be produced to meet this demand. So if you look at conventional oil and deep water, we only get this far. But when you add in oil sands, tight oil that's being developed due to fracking, as well as natural gas liquids, you'll notice that by 2030, we have supply in excess of demand. And in actuality, once you add in biofuels and other liquids, we really expect North America to be a net exporter of liquid fuel by 2020. So what about the other regions of the world? So if you look at Latin America, their demand is increasing with each decade as we go out. And you can see here that they will continue to be as they are today, they will continue to be a slight net exporter of liquids. Africa, who is a net exporter today, they will continue to be a net exporter, but you can see that their total supply is not going to increase much over the outlook period. And internally, as their standards of living increase, their internal demands will go up. And so while they remain a net exporter, the amount they export will actually be less. Europe, net importer, and will continue to be a net importer. Their demands are expected to decrease, but their supply will also decrease along with it. And so Europe will continue to require a significant amount of imports. Russia and the Middle East, as they are today, they will continue to be significant exporters of oil, natural gas liquids. And then the real story is Asia Pacific. Driven primarily by China, you can see how their demand is increasing significantly, and their supply really isn't going anywhere. And so they are a huge importer of oil, and they will continue to be a huge importer of oil. In fact, by the year 2040, in the second half of the outlook period, China will have to import 80% of their oil. Now that's the oil side. Let's look at the natural gas side. Again, much like the oil story, we expect due to the development of what we call unconventional production, which is basically gas fracking, shale oil and gas production. North America is destined to be a net exporter of natural gas by 2020. In fact, it's interesting, if you follow the energy industry, I think it was only about 5, maybe 7 years ago, a number of companies in the United States, energy companies in the United States, were obtaining permits to build liquefied natural gas import facilities. Then, due to the shale gas revolution, the quantities of natural gas that we're producing have started to increase significantly. And ExxonMobil is not the only company that's now gone back and changed their permits to change their LNG import facilities into LNG export facilities. In fact, North America will overtake Russia in the Caspian Sea region when it comes to natural gas production. You can see here, North America will become an exporter quite soon. Latin America is relatively balanced. Africa will have some excess. Europe will continue to be a significant importer of natural gas. Russia and the Middle East will also continue to be exporters. And then Asia Pacific, much like the story on the liquid side, Asia Pacific will be a significant importer of natural gas. So I've talked a lot about imports and exports. And so the key to those imports and exports happening is free trade. So if you think about energy as the lifeblood of the world's economy, then free trade is really the circulatory system that allows that lifeblood to flow. Even in countries and regions that are relatively balanced as far as supply and demand, they may still have a significant amount of exports of one type of energy and imports of another type of energy in order to optimize the cost of the energy to the consumers in that region. So free trade is critical to this flow of energy back around the world to happen. When you look at liquid energy trade, by 2040 we expect right now about half of liquids demand is supplied locally and half is either imported or exported, and we expect that split to remain about the same. On the gas side, while local production will increase, what's interesting to note here is the increase in liquefied natural gas, so the natural gas that's being imported and exported. And that's expected to rise to about 25% of the total gas demand by 2040, compared to only about 15% today. And that's what's driving those LNG export facilities being built here in the United States. So this graph is really interesting, and I've only got a couple more slides, so I hope you're still with me. What this graph shows is we take a look 30 years in the past and 30 years into the future, and we take a look at demand for energy by region in quadrillion BTUs, and you can see very interesting trends. For instance, back in 1980, the world only needed about 300 quadrillion BTUs of energy. And you can see how that's increased to today and where it'll go through 2040. And as I've highlighted earlier, we expect energy within the OECD to remain relatively flat, while China increases quite significantly, and those key growth countries increase as well. And the type of energy that we use also evolves over time. So as you can see here, back in 1980 when we were demanding 300 quadrillion BTUs, you can see how the split between oil, coal, and natural gas differs from where we are today. So coal has increased, oil has increased, natural gas has increased quite a bit. But you can see the emergence of new fuel sources, such as nuclear, and then other renewables such as wind and solar. The big story here is technology. In order for the world to evolve the type of energy type of energy source that it's using, it takes technology to develop those new sources of energy. It takes technology to continue to find new sources of oil and natural gas as well.
Ernie, is the possibility of legislation for the Keystone Pipeline being included in that forecast?
And that's a great question, and I can't say specifically whether the team that puts this outlook together accounted for the Keystone XL pipeline being built or not built. But what I will say is whether the Keystone pipeline is built or not built, the energy available out of the oil sands in Canada will get developed. The question isn't whether or not the Keystone pipeline will enable the development of that energy source supply. It's what the Keystone XL pipeline, how that matters is where that source of energy goes. If the pipeline isn't built and it's more economic to take that oil and put it on a boat and send it to Asia Pacific than it is to put it in a pipeline to Gulf Coast, U.S. Gulf Coast refineries, it'll go that direction. So the Keystone XL pipeline, it has a factor on where that energy goes, but the energy is going to get developed and go somewhere. It's just a matter of whether it goes to Asia or it comes to the Gulf Coast. So I'd like to wrap up my presentation just by reiterating 3 key points. Those are that the improvement in living standards worldwide is a key driver for growing energy demand. And this is a good news story. I mean, we talked about the billions of people that will move up into the middle class, have some discretionary spending, and increase their standards of living. Secondly, the world will continue to need a huge volume of energy to meet the energy requirements of our modern life. While energy growth may not be growing, or energy demand may not be growing in the United States and Europe, it is growing globally. And again, between now and 2040, we expect total energy demand to increase by about 35%. And so we're already producing a lot of energy. Remember those 12 billion gallons of gasoline equivalent every single day. In order to continue to meet the energy demand for our modernizing world in the developing countries, that will increase by 30%. And lastly, I've mentioned it a couple times, didn't put a specific slide up there, but really the last thing I'd like to leave you with is the primary way in which we meet this growing energy demand is technology. And that takes engineers and scientists finding new ways to access sources of energy that we know about but can't get to, as well as finding and discovering new sources of energy that we don't even know about. And so technology is really the key to meeting our growing energy demand. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. And I'll open up the floor if anybody's got any questions. Okay. Well, thank you very much. As Jesus noted, this is my 3rd time coming and speaking with you. It's a pleasure. I'm always happy to share this story and the role that ExxonMobil plays in meeting the world's growing energy demand. So thank you very much for your time.
Okay, good morning. I'm Mike Richmond. I'm a manager with the Financial Compliance Division at Texas Education Agency. I'd like to go over a couple of things before we get started in the next presentation. Just kind of some updates and stuff that's happening. They are looking at the, coming up with some revisions to the first criteria and so forth. And one thing I do like to kind of mention that's probably coming about is starting with the 15 audits, is that little grace period you had between like January and February, it will be going away. So if the audits aren't in by the due date on like I believe it's like the January 28th, and it's different for the June 30th year ends, you won't have that grace period. It'll be a failure on your first. So that's something you need to be aware of that's coming up, and make sure your auditors and the audits get in on time. Another thing I'd like to kind of mention, wherever I go, I like to mention this, is on the auditors themselves. We've been having some problems past few years where districts get in, they do have audit done, and come to find out the auditor did not have a firm license at the time the audit was done, and districts had to redo the audits. In the Valley, we've had like 5 districts had to do like 3 years worth. Up in the Panhandle, there was a couple of districts that had to do at least a couple of years. And we just had a charter school, they're having to redo one. So it's very important when you engage the auditor that you ensure that they have a firm license. It's very easy to go onto the State Board of Public Accountancy website and check out their license status. When they have completed their engagement, and you need to verify it because it could change. They could be licensed when you started, and by the time they get ready to issue that report, they don't no longer have a firm license. So you want to ensure that they do have a firm license so you don't get caught in that trap to have to redo the audits. Another area is that we're changing up. One of the things that we do is what we call fiscal management review. We do a risk analysis based on the external audit reports, LBB performance audits, and we come up with a number of districts or charter schools that will visit during the year and do what we call an audit follow-up fiscal management review. And some things we're adding to that is, number one, we're looking at conflict of interest because that has been a problem lately. We're looking at the financial management report, which I'll also talk. That's something that is required when you do your meeting dealing with your first rating to the public. Also, we're looking at mandated programs. So I know several years ago, our division, when it was school audits, we did reviews of the mandated programs, make sure you were expending the amount that you're supposed to, and actually getting reclaims on that if you didn't spend it. Well, we're going to be starting looking at the mandated programs again. We're going to be doing some analysis, make sure what we're going to probably do is look at a 3-year period, probably 12, 13, and 14. 14 teams will be coming in this February. And we'll look at your allocated compared to your percent direct expenditures that you were trying to spend over those 3 years. And if we see a negative in there, that there'll probably be there's some type of letter. We're going to be developing procedures how we're going to handle that. So we're going to be looking at those management programs. Some of the things we may do is actually, if we see some areas where, say, there's low academic performance and there's questions about your mandated programs, that we may actually require or request information from the district or charter school as to give us some of those expenditures. We want to see where you're spending that money. Are you spending it appropriately? So that's something that may be coming up. Yes?
Do you mind defining mandated programs?
That's like your special ed, your comp ed, your bilingual ESL, your gifted and talented, and your career tech programs. You get those special allotments. That's assuming the legislature didn't come in and totally change that. Because I know if y'all have been reading the newspaper and everything where they proposed that bill where they created the super finance district. One thing that Lisa Dawn Fisher was, we had a managers meeting yesterday when she said in that bill, there was no splitting of any of these special allotments. It was all going to be just one regular allotment and there wouldn't be any special allotments. Of course, there's no intention really to pass that bill. That was just something to start discussion and everything, but she just kind of mentioned that. So we don't know what's going to happen in the future. School finance could change and they could do away with these special allotments and just give everybody a certain dollar amount or whatever. But as of now, those allotments are in place and we will be starting to monitor those expenditures, especially comp ed. There's actually in law certain rules and things that the agency, due to the past drift that we had kind of stopped doing and looking at comp ed, because there's certain requirements that if we see problems and everything, where we can actually require the district to have a special audit done under comp ed. So we're going to look at those rules that are in law. And of course, if anything changes in the legislature, that'll be addressed. But we're going to be looking at that and starting to follow up on those things. So that's something we're going to be looking at more closely. Now, conflict of interest. Like I said, we've been having several issues with conflict of interest. Whether it's either with the board, individuals in the district, or whatever. So this is an area of interest for us that's been involved. It's been an interest for the OIG at the Department of Education. They actually have at least 3 charter schools required us to actually do investigations based on what they had found when they were out at those schools. So that is something of more interest. So we're going to be discussing that. Basically, you'll find the conflict of interest laws in several areas. The local government code, chapter 171, that's going to deal with your affidavits, and that primarily deals with your school board. And surprisingly, we are totally surprised how many school board members are not aware of the requirements for conflict of interest filing of affidavits and financial disclosures. So that's an important area that the board members get a new board member. That should be an automatic training. We make them on that board. Hey, here are the rules. Do you have any potential conflicts that you need to file an affidavit on? We will discuss that, and I'll kind of give examples of where we found that. The other one is 176. That also deals with the board, but this is a financial disclosure statement, and you get your questionnaires. The superintendent is a requirement as executive officer to have a financial disclosure statement. This also can apply to certain employees if the board or school requires that, and that would be something I would strongly recommend because it's probably something, a policy or something like that the district should adopt to require some disclosure by employees of the district if there's even some type of potential conflict or just the fact that they have interest in a business that's doing business with the school, just so you in the business office and the superintendent administration do not get blindsided if somebody starts complaining, hey, they're giving this contract to this campus or whatever, and or from a business, and there's relationships going on like that. So you don't want to be blindsided. So it's good to have that policy in place in there. And a lot of the larger districts, I see that as part of their policies. Administration code. This is one that kind of caught me by surprise. I wasn't aware of this until recently, and so that's something we started implementing in, like I say, in our fiscal management reviews, and we're finding several districts are not doing this. Is a certain financial management report that has to be part of that public hearing that you have on your first ratings. So we'll kind of discuss the things that have to be in that. Also, your federal conflict of interest rules. If you receive any federal money, you should have a conflict of interest policy, and it's basically every district uses task force board, and they have the legal portion in there, so they mention about the federal requirements. But you should also include, like I say, in your local policies, some conflict of interest requirements. Okay. Who does 171 apply to? This is going to apply to your school board. And basically, if a school board member or a relative within the required degree of affinity and constant, well, whatever, either married or blood relation, then they have to have filed this affidavit. Or also in real property. And the requirements are, if they have 10% ownership in the voting stock, or at least $15,000 value. Or if a person has interest in a property worth more than $2,500, or if their gross income from the previous year from that business entity, that 10% came from that business entity. Example from this is in Beaumont ISD. I'm sure you saw them in the newspaper and aware that the agency put a board of managers in, and one of the items was one of the board members did have a conflict. District had contracted with a petroleum products company in which he was a regional manager for a convenience store that was part of that company, and he had failed to file that affidavit. And I'll discuss another one that we had issued there, but it deals with a lot of employees and stuff too, so I'll talk about that in a little bit. And again, it's a Class C misdemeanor, and there's no exceptions. When I talk about 176, you'll see there's some exceptions to the rule that you can overcome that violation. So like I say, get a new board member, they need to be brought up on the requirements here, because most times we find is that they always say, well, we were never given that information or whatever. So you need to ensure that the new board members have given some training in these areas. Okay, now the financial disclosure statement under 176. This will apply to the superintendent. So a superintendent meets the requirements, he will have to have a financial disclosure statement. It applies to school board members. They also will have to file a disclosure statement. And at the district's discretion, they can extend it to lower level employees who are involved in the contract process. Okay, what are the requirements to have to file this financial disclosure statement? If a person, basically if you're dealing with a business and you get at least $2,500, or the individual gets at least $2,500 of income during a year, 12-month period, then they need to file this financial disclosure statement. So this is very easy to be applicable to the superintendent or other individuals. And it has to be filed not later than 5 p.m. on the 7th business day, on the date which the officer becomes aware of the facts requiring the filing of the statement. And basically the record retention officer, this is the person that has to be filed with. So make sure that's where these records get filed. A lot of times we'll ask for these documents and everything, and they have to search all over the place and everything like that, and you have a lot of trouble finding them, or they don't find them. There are also requirements as to what are required in these affidavits and these disclosure statements and questionnaires that are in the law and stuff like that. You may go to the Texas Ethics Commission. They have some question and answers concerning these issues and some example affidavit and everything. You need to make sure this documentation is on file and requires the information, it has the information that's required. You'd be surprised when we ask for this information or we ask for the affidavits. A lot of times what we get is, I'm sure you all are used to this every year, you have your external auditor. The auditor will send a questionnaire to the board members asking for nepotism and conflict of interest. We'll get those back as what they say is how they met the affidavit or whatever, and that's not meeting the requirement. So you need to make sure these affidavits and disclosure statements do meet the criteria and have the information that's in there. And again, this can be extended to other employees who has authority to approve contracts on behalf of the local government entity. How often do they have to be changed? Once they're filed, unless there's some type of change that happens, maybe there's another business or whatever, then you'll have to refile another one. So So basically, they're pretty much good until there's some other change that happens. Also, disclosures dealing with gifts. You know, if it's worth over a certain dollar amount, then you have to also have a financial disclosure statement. So it's not just business receipts or income or whatever, it's also if there's gifts involved. And this is just shows you the timeline for when to file that information. And on questionnaires, how many of y'all hand part of your vendor package or whatever provide that conflict of interest questionnaire to the vendors? That's good. That should be just standard practice. Now you'll find out that if they don't file it, if they don't give you that information back, you don't have a district have a duty to ensure that they do. It's good to give them that information because again, you're trying to prevent any type of public outcry or something like happens like that. If there is some type of conflict that does not get disclosed to you and it gets out in the press and everything, then they make a big deal of it. So this is for your protection. So even though you don't have a duty, it's good to have that questionnaire as part of your vendor package and require them to fill it out. And here's some of the things that are required to be in the questionnaire. And again, it's the 7th business day. What can happen if you violate this law? Well, if you're the local government entity can reprimand you, suspend you, or terminate your employment. So that could be pretty serious, let alone the class system misdemeanor. You actually could get terminated by the district or the charter school that you work with. Are there exceptions? Well, there's a big where there's no exception for the affidavits. There is an exception for these questionnaires and financial disclosure statements. Once your district makes you aware, hey, you didn't file this affidavit, or you didn't file this financial disclosure, or you didn't give us the questionnaire, they have 7 days to get one in. That will overcome the violation. So if after that 7 days they still haven't filed it, then they're in violation and they could be subject to the penalties under this law. Okay. Told you I was going to talk to you about a case that we have. We're about to issue a final report. This case, we have a district in the Valley. There's roughly about 3,000 students or so. It deals with all family members on the board and everything. On the board at the time, we had a father and son that were on the board. They had a business that the school district did business with. We had another uncle and nephew on the board, the nephew being the president of the board. And the uncle and nephew basically had about 22 to 23 family members that were employed by the district. That included the head of the transportation and maintenance department, who was the father and the brother to the board member. They had the maintenance director was the patriarch, and his son was the assistant superintendent. He had another son that was the risk management director, whose wife was the business manager. A couple of the principals were either daughter-in-law or daughter related in there, so it was quite extensive. The technology director was a son, another son. The maintenance director, the school district did business with his, I guess you could call it a restaurant. They did a lot of catering, like to the board and stuff like that, but we could never find it open or anything like that. But we're talking about a couple $100,000 over a couple-year period. In fact, we had one invoice that was for Fish dinners for like $25 a serving. It was for the board members, so that was quite expensive, so we had that. Then we had the business manager's husband, who was the son, set up a business where he did safety supplies that he was doing business with the school. Then the other one, that was the technology director, he was selling computers to the school. Well, the board president, his dad, the architect, I think another one were indicted on bribery and stuff down there, dealing with construction projects. They basically had the architect, they hired an architect, and he's also with his construction manager at risk, which is not necessarily a good thing because the architect is kind of supposed to protect you. But it's, you know, something that's allowable under law. But so they all got indicted. The business manager's husband's got indicted. And so there's still more indictments going on there. But that's where I tell you, this conflict of interest, having a strong policy that will prevent a lot of this and also at least have disclosure of it is important. So that was a big issue down there. We're going to be issuing our final, like I say, our final report on that issue. And of course, you know, we're dealing with the superintendent. We also hit him for disclosure statement because he sold his pickup to the district, but he insisted the maintenance worker or his worker that was working for him sold the vehicle to the district without his knowledge. So yeah, so his this worker, and we interviewed him, got his testimony, basically went to the district, got $20,000 for the vehicle, but the superintendent didn't know his vehicle was being sold until the guy came to him and said, "Here's some money for your vehicle," which he refused to take, so the guy threw it on his seat in the vehicle. Of course, he held this money for like 6 months. And finally, he attempted to return it, but the business manager would not take the money. So that took an extra couple of months before that finally the money got back in the school's account. So that was the superintendent. So that's another kind of conflict situation. Of course, FBI was in at the time, so that's the reason why we think the money was returned. Yeah.
I have a question. How did you figure out that all these people were related to each other? Did they divulge it in the?
Yeah, we asked for.
They have the same home address.
we actually, believe me, we asked for a breakdown, and what we had is like the senior, juniors, and junior again. I mean, we were trying to figure out who was who because the father of the maintenance director, who was a senior too, had been on the previous few years back.
They all have the same last name, or?
Yeah, there was the last name. And the president of the board, who was one of the son, was also the city mayor. But he resigned all that. But then one of the other brothers was the mayor pro tem. So he had this issue. So when our team first was down there, we actually, there was some concerns and everything like that, so we had a Texas Ranger in there at the school while we were there. And there's a lot of concerns there with health and safety.
Because the nurse was related to it.
Yeah, so then we had a lot of construction. And we've been working, of course, with law enforcement and everything. And I came across with one of the construction contracts that I thought was very unusual. And that the business was basically, and they did about $200,000 worth of business with the school, who basically, you see the business being created, like right before or during this period of time construction was going on. And then less than a year later, after all the work's done, the business goes away. So I said, that may be suspicious. There's something maybe going on there you may want to look into. But there's just a whole lot of corruption going on there in the school. So that's where it's very important to have these conflict of interest rules and policies in place. Because if they don't prevent it, at least it gives you the knowledge something's there that you don't get blindsided and find out about later. Also, if you have these questionnaires and financial disclosure statements, you must maintain a list and it must be available to the public. And also has to be on your website, so you need to be aware of the disclosure requirements on that. Federal conflict of interest laws and requirements. The federal rules are a little bit more stringent because they not only apply to the board members and stuff like that, or it's basically anybody dealing with the federal programs or involved in federal contracts and so forth. Number one, if you receive federal money, you must have a code of conduct for your employees. And there cannot be a real or apparent conflict involved when you're dealing with federal funds. So this goes down like federal program directors, anybody it's not just the engaging in the contract or helping develop the contract, but it's the administration of the contract. So where the purchasing department or finance office may actually do the contracting, if it's the responsibility of individuals to oversee that contract, then that also comes into play. And again, this is real or apparent. And again, it's a family member. A case we had dealt with this, we dealt with the OIG at the Department of Education, was in a San Antonio district. We had a case where a federal program director, in this case, they were over like the private schools area, and his assistant, the federal program director, basically was contracting with his wife to do training and everything for teachers and employees at these private schools that were receiving Title I funds. His assistant, thought that was a good idea, but he could do it better. So he contracted with his wife to do the same thing, training, but then he also worked with a company to do some other services for the private school using Title I funds, and he got a kickback from it. So when the feds were investigating this and we provided the information that we had, they basically, of course, there was no problem with the gentleman that was receiving the kickbacks because that's actually, he was profiteering on that. The other areas, they had a little problem with the U.S. attorney saying, well, did the service actually get performed? In this case, services were actually performed. And so they were kind of backing off on that, even though it did violate the rules. You see there's no criminal penalties attached to this, unless there's some theft or something going on. Well, then I guess there was kind of an outcry, so they're looking back into that, seeing what they could do on this issue, where they were profiteering based on their wife doing those services. So there are things dealing with federal. Another area is child nutrition. We've had some charter schools where they contracted with the cafeteria manager's husband's business and everything like that. So there are issues, and it can be in a child nutrition program. So this is something you also need to be aware of and look into when you're doing your contracting and everything. And get a strong policy out there for conflict of interest. Like I say, there's some individuals. I would suggest applying the disclosure requirement to all employees. I mean, they don't have to file anything unless there's a potential conflict there, and then at that time say, hey, even though they may be a teacher, their husband or a family member is doing business with the school, they don't have any oversight of it, but it doesn't help to have that disclosure and let you know. So if that gets out in the public, they're going to try to warp this into somehow the district is doing business strictly because that teacher's the favorite of the superintendent or whatever, so it's good to get that information and make, know that that's public and everything, so it's not like there's something to be hidden and everything, so I would suggest that. Again, same thing with gratuities and gifts you need to be aware of, especially when you're dealing with federal money. Okay, like I say, this is something, this next area was, I knew that, you had the public meetings and everything for your first ratings and so forth like that, but I wasn't aware that there's actually a report that you have to prepare that's for the public and available to the public. And that's actually in TAC 109.1005. And it's called your Financial Management Report. Okay, of course, has your rating and everything you're going in there, but also requires that you have a copy of the superintendent's contract. Now, if you've got the superintendent's contract posted on your website, then you don't necessarily have to have it part of this report, but if you don't, it needs to be part of this public report. Summary schedule for a 12-month period of expenditures paid on behalf of or total reimbursements received by the superintendent and each board member, including transactions resulting from the use of the school's district or open enrollment charter school's credit card to cover expenses incurred by them. Because a lot of times there's going to be a lot of meals and other expenses used on like the superintendent's credit card, stuff like that. So that's going to have to be summarized in this report. And so report the meals, lodging, transportation, water, fuel, and other items. And speaking of the travel and everything, one area that we have also a big problem with a lot of districts is a lot of districts will give advanced travel. They'll pay hotel directly and so forth, but do not require an expense report filed by that individual that does the travel when they return. You need to make sure there's an expense report that details all the expenses related to that travel by that individual. That's to ensure you got a accountable travel system for IRS, and that you do account for all monies given to that employee. Okay, summary schedule for a fiscal year, dollar amount of compensation received or fees received by the superintendent from another school district, open enrollment charter school, or any other entity. Again, this comes to concerns where this, a lot of times superintendents may have consulting jobs and so forth outside the district that may or may not allowable by the board and so forth. So that's something that has to be disclosed. Okay. Again, the summary schedule dealing with gifts. Summary schedule for a fiscal year, the dollar amount by board member for the aggregate amount of business transactions with the school district or open enrollment charter school. We see a lot more of this in the charter schools. We had this one charter school which we did investigation on, who basically had the bus company that was doing services to the charter school in an amount of about $900,000. They also own the facilities. So, I mean, that was the superintendent, not the charter holder, which we also had problems with that, but this is actually the superintendent who basically was on the board of the charter holder. They created the school and everything, but they actually own the land and facilities, so they were doing businesses with there and there. One of the requirements for charter schools on their governance form is they're supposed to disclose all this information if they receive any income from the charter. But this has been kind of issue there, so a lot of times these rules come into place because of the issues that we find out, either charter schools or school districts, and a lot of these requirements came about because of that. Take for instance the travel. We just did a fiscal management review of a district, and LBB did a performance review first there, and they had a lot of questions, especially with one board member's travel. The other board members were averaging between like 1,000 to 2,000, and the second highest was like 4,000. But they had one board member who had like $26,000 in board travel expenses. And this board member liked to travel wherever the superintendent with, wherever there was meeting, anything like that. So, and the problem with this school, they weren't filing any expense reports. Talking about the travel and stuff, I mentioned that school in the valley. We also had problems with that board member problem, where they were given advance mileage, cost of hotel, and meals. No accounting for it. No hotel receipts, so they actually went. And we're talking about mileage for each board member from like the valley, Boston, or out to California and stuff like that. Typically, you know, these people are not going to drive out for one thing, and you know, so they didn't account for that. You know, if they went, and we have doubt several of them even went on some of these because we interviewed some of them, and they could not recall being there. The second one reminded, don't you remember the NHL championships there in Chicago or whatever, you know, so there's no documentation, especially you have no hotel receipts showing that actually went there. So there's no accounting for that. So that's basically can be considered income to these individuals. Let alone, like I said, I doubt if any of them, if all of them actually went on these trips. Because like I said, they each got mileage. You're talking about, you know, 2,000 miles round trip or whatever. So it's important to have that expense report done. Okay. Again, you're going to talk about your rating. It needs to be in the newspaper. You know about the public notice about your hearing. And this report has to be disseminated to all the public that attends that meeting. And it has to be held available for the public for a 3-year period. And like I say, we're going into some districts now as part of these fiscal management reviews, so we're asking for this. And a lot of times we've got blank stares. What are you talking about, fiscal management report? So this is something as my presentations and everything, I'm starting to bring up now, just to make sure individuals are aware of it and make sure that's prepared when you have your financial rating meeting. Again, corrective action plans. Okay, any questions at this point? Hey, it's all good news, right? But like I say, I want to stress, have a strong conflict of interest policy. It'll save you a lot of trouble in the future, and hopefully keep your district's name out of the press and stuff like that. So if somebody comes, hey, do you know so-so has this business and y'all do business? Oh yeah, they filed the disclosure statement. We're quite aware of it. We make sure controls in place, that everything's above board. Cut that right off. Yes.
Mike, I do have a question. It's not, it doesn't sound like it is, but it's not your understanding that board members under that chapter 171 should preemptively file these conflict of interest disclosure forms, even if there's not an existing conflict at the time, just
right.
to list businesses that they own, or their employer, to identify their employer. And I mention that because I've had somebody from TPA doing another type of investigation, but then asking about those conflict of interest forms and suggesting that the board members, that the district was supposed to have them on file, even if there had not been an issue that had come up about, so.
I would say I've been over with, I would say in our division we have a new employee that has been into doing a lot of this stuff, and we had to discuss that with them, saying, hey, this is before when that contract's entered in, they need to get that filed. Not hey, because my example was, what if you have a board member who owns a ranch? Unless the district is going to start buying cows from him for the cow nutrition program or whatever. Yeah, he has a business and everything, but chances are he's actually going to never do business. Well, he might sell some land, so I guess they could. But the likelihood that he's going to do business school is not there, so he wouldn't need to file it just because he has one. But once they become aware that they're going to bid on something, or their business, is going to be involved with the district, then they need to get that on file.
So the follow-up question, I think I know the answer to this, but I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on it. So let's say a board member is employed at in management at a local hotel, and the district does not have a contract with the hotel. There's no issue that's come before the board, but periodically they'll hold luncheons there, something, that might, over a year period, maybe be less than $1,000, something like that. Is that, or they'll have a hotel cater some, sometimes they'll have a board workshop or something in the hotel.
The board members has a financial interest in that?
Yeah, the board member is employed by
Oh, employed?
the hotel. Is it
Well, if they don't
employed?
receive income over $2,500 from that.
Or I thought it was more than 10, no.
Well, that the financial disclosure statement, the affidavit is 10% or,
Of their income, isn't it?
yeah, 10% of their yearly income comes from there.
Yeah, this board member, 100% of his income, he's an employee of the hotel.
Well, then if they're 100% of their income there, they meet the 10% requirement so on the safe side would be to file it. It's not gonna hurt.
And right, and it doesn't matter that it's not an issue that it's not a matter that there wasn't a contract that came before the board. I mean, they just need to
Right.
do it because there's been some business.
Yeah,
dealings
because
with the
basically,
district.
even though you don't have a written contract, when you do business, you're entering into a contract. When I come in there, I'm gonna stay at your hotel, and this is the charge, there's basically a non-written contract that's there.
And even though it's a smaller amount that's
Yeah.
within the superintendent's purchasing authority, for example.
Right, because they meet the criteria of 10%,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
file, be on the safe side, because it's not gonna hurt them, and if the board approves the bills, make sure you just pull that bill out from the bills and vote on that stuff, because some boards vote and approve all boards at the end of the month or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
So just be aware of that. A lot of times they'll have the affidavit and everything, but then they forget about, oh, we just voted to approve all the bills. Well, they're approving and they're supposed to abstain from any votes on the business transaction at that entity. If it requires on the affidavit requirement.
Was that truly their only employee?
Yeah, employee.
Because he doesn't get, he gets, because he's employed there, but he doesn't own the business.
Right, but the other requirement was if 10% of their income comes from that business.
Oh.
And like I say, it hurt to side on the side of caution, so. Because, like I say, somebody that's disgruntled with the district or a disgruntled employee has access to certain information, and they'll start making like something's really wrong going on there because it's not disclosed and everything. So if something disclosed, it just protects you.
You can do that.
Yeah, he's got to file.
Yeah.
Can't vote on
And Sunny Sadler is the other person that done on this. She worked on the one on Beaumont and stuff like that. So we've been, like I say, we've been doing with a lot more lately, and this is something that we're looking into. And ever we visit a district or so forth, we'll make sure the affidavits or the disclosure statements are on file. Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, as y'all have heard or else know if you've seen me speak before, I'm an attorney out of Laredo, Texas. I represent school districts for going on almost 20 years now. I was going to mention, as I'm talking to Mike from TEA, I'm actually, one of my clients is undergoing a TEA investigation, and so I was interested to hear what he said about it. It's another department though that is conducting the investigation. It's the complaints department, and I mentioned to him that some of the statements made by the person at TEA that we're dealing with were kind of seemed to be expanding the requirements for filing these conflict of interest statements and affidavits, and then going on and talking to this person who's talking about how the board members should be filing these documents called personal financial statements, which are forms that elected officials are required to file with the state. And I started, oh my gosh, I didn't even know about that. I hadn't heard about that in 20 years of practicing. And after investigation and everything, it turned out, no, that wasn't quite right. And I think when Mike said, well, they have one or two new employees, I think that
is just learning the different requirements for board members. But my experience with this investigation we're going through right now is as typical. I think this is typical with TEA from what I've seen in the past, is they were looking at a separate issue involving a board member. We had an anonymous complaint where the board member was accused of just basically trying to pressure the district to get into a contract with a particular vendor, just pressuring, no relationship alleged with the vendor, and TEA is doing this ongoing investigation, and it's turning into more than that. It's expanding its sort of investigation creep where they're now asking about conflict of interest statements. It was interesting to hear Mike talk about that. That's an emphasis of theirs now, looking in that, because it may just be by default if they're looking at some other complaint, they're going to go in and start testing your documentation on conflict of interest and those types of things. So it's something to be aware of. I'm actually doing a training tomorrow morning to one of my boards on the conflict of interest issues and reporting and filling out these forms because of this issue, this ongoing issue that school district has with TEA. So just a lesson learned there. But anyway, today I wanted to talk to you all about contract issues, liability and immunity issues. It's going to be a little bit of an academic presentation in the sense that it's going to talk about the legal background for these issues relating to contracts. I don't do that a lot with my presentations because I generally feel like you all, it seems to me more beneficial for you all to have the actual hands-on practical information that you need in your day-to-day work. But this I thought was an interesting topic. There is a background basis to it. We're eventually leading up to the discussion about what under a statute that's been developing here and that was passed a few years back, where the legislature passed a law that said that it was waiving immunity for contracts when school districts, when other state governmental entities enter into contracts, that they're waiving immunity for lawsuits relating to those contracts, because there had been, as an attorney, and you all probably wouldn't be aware of this, but as an attorney I knew that over the past 5-6 years, going on to 10 years, there's been this ongoing legal debate in the state of Texas about the extent to which school districts could be sued for contracts, for breach of contract, and whether or not districts had liability for that. And as you'll see as we go through this presentation, that there was this tug and pull between the court system, the legal system, the courts of Texas, and the legislature about the courts trying to interpret whether or not there is liability for certain things, and the legislature finally coming out and passing a statute and saying, okay, this is what the rule is going to be on this, and then having that develop over the past few years, and there's been some recent developments in that area. So this is where we'll start. What's known as the concept of sovereign and governmental immunity. And those of you all who maybe have taken education courses or you're going for your certificates and things like that, you'll have presentations on this area of the law. What this essentially means is when you see the word sovereign, that means we're talking about sovereign as in the king, as a king of a country. And this was a very old theory and legal principle that went back to England, and when our legal system, when we came over in the ships from England and brought over a lot of their legal system and adopted that, was this concept that you can't sue the king, that the king has immunity from everything. You can't, there's no liability for anything. There's a line from a Mel Brooks movie, I think it was called The History of the World Part 1, where he says it's good to be king. And that's what it was. You had, the general rule is that the government, now in the United States, that if you're the government, you have immunity from everything, from any kind of liability, unless that immunity is waived. And so here's the general rules on that. These are quotes from cases that talk about this principle of law. It says sovereign immunity protects the state from lawsuits for money damages. That political subdivisions of the state, so it goes down from the general government, the state of Texas, we talk about the state of Texas. Well, does it apply? Who else does it apply to other than the state itself? Well, it applies to subdivisions of the state, including cities, are entitled to such immunity, referred to as governmental immunity, unless it has been waived. So for our purposes, sovereign and governmental immunity are essentially just interchangeable terms. Sovereign immunity encompasses immunity from suit. This gets a little more technical, the difference between immunity from suit and immunity from liability. But meaning that theoretically you can't even sue the state without getting their permission, much less have immunity from liability, which protects the state from judgments, even if it's consented to the suit. And if you all have ever, I don't know that you would have, but if you ever had any experience with any kind of litigation with the state of Texas through the Attorney General's office, even if you get a judgment against them, it is a hassle to get them to pay the judgment. They have certain rules and procedures for it, but you literally have to go back to the legislature. With the legislature, I guess they approve a list of judgments and payments during their biennial appropriations discussions, because the Attorney General will tell you, well, now we've got to take this back and go take it back and get it paid. And it can take a long time to get a judgment paid, even if you had the right to sue them in the first place. So sovereign immunity deprives a trial court of subject matter jurisdiction. What that means is that, and I've done this a lot on behalf of my clients, if a governmental entity, including school districts, gets sued for something that they're immune from, you file a motion with the court to say, Judge, you need to dismiss this case because there is no jurisdiction over these claims. So there's no power to hear these claims against this governmental entity. So that's what it means. It deprives of subject matter jurisdiction. If you hear a lawyer talking about that we filed a motion to dismiss on jurisdictional basis, this is generally probably what they're talking about. Okay, so this is part of the discussion we're going to enter into, that sovereign immunity is a common law doctrine that initially developed without any legislative or constitutional enactment. So it was not that the legislator or Congress with the United States came out and said, oh, we're going to have a statute that says we're immune. This was just this legal theory that was developed by the courts, where they just recognized this historical precedent and this historical theory and legal principle about this immunity of the state and, again, the sovereign. And you'll see that still plays out today in the way that the law is developed. Okay, but policy reasons. So again, these are all things that are stated. I'm not making this up. These aren't from papers. This is all things that are cited in cases in Texas Supreme Court language, that a lack of immunity may hamper governmental functions by requiring tax resources to be used for defending lawsuits and paying judgments rather than using those resources for their intended purposes. Now, if you all have ever handled having to appropriate or set aside funds for a lawsuit for potential liability, you would maybe know the impact this idea is that if you suddenly face some kind of lawsuit with the school district or with the governmental entity who said, well, gee, that we may have liability, maybe it's a type of claim that maybe there is liability for, and you may have to pay it. You have to start budgeting and setting aside funds and worrying if it was a big liability, you'd have to worry about where those funds are going to come from. The legislature has expressed a desire to preserve the interest in managing fiscal matters and appropriations by maintaining sovereign immunity unless it's clearly and unambiguously stated otherwise. And again, that's part of the rule, that unless there is a clear waiver of liability, you have liability. But so this is the idea that suits for money damages against the states may threaten the financial integrity of the states. And at the time of the founding, many of the states could have been forced into insolvency but for their immunity. So they're talking about even going back to the history of the founding of the United States, that they're recognizing that this was an important legal principle that protected the states. Okay, but you can waive immunity. There are certain circumstances, either judicially, that's been recognized and developed judicially or legislatively. And this is one of the initial principles that was developed. It said, well, one of the ways you can waive immunity is if the state, the government, asserts a claim against somebody else. So if you get sued by the state and you tried to sue them back because you had some counterclaim or something, and the state says, well, you can't sue me because I'm immune, but I'm going to sue you. Well, the courts had determined that that was unfair. They decided that, as a matter of principle, was not fair. So that if the governmental entity gets itself involved in litigation, well, then they're opening themselves up to being sued. And the courts determined this, again, as a legal principle, said that if they're going to engage in litigation for affirmative claims for money damages, the entity would presumably have made a decision to expend resources to pay litigation costs. So once they've committed themselves and said, well, we're going to get into this fight, and we're going to initiate the fight, and we're going to spend money to do it, Well, that if the opposing party's claims can operate as an offset to reduce the recovery, no tax resources will be called upon to pay a judgment, and the fiscal planning of the governmental entity should not be disrupted. So that was the theory. Now, I guess in theory, you could have a counterclaim, what we legally call a counterclaim, where let's call it a school district, files a lawsuit and asserts a claim for, let's say it's $100,000. Well, you get a counterclaim for $200,000. Well, that doesn't quite fit into this theory about, well, there's no harm, no foul, because it doesn't affect the planning if you've waived immunity once you got into the lawsuit. But this determination that a governmental entity's immunity from suit does not extend to a situation where the entity has filed suit is consistent with the policy involved with immunity. In this situation, so this is the Texas Supreme Court talking here, we believe it would be fundamentally unfair to allow a governmental entity to assert affirmative claims against a party while claiming it has immunity to claims being made by that party. So, so this is what I was talking about a minute ago. That courts have generally deferred to the legislature to waive immunity. The courts you see, you read cases over the years from the Texas Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court. They'll say, well, gee, you know, we want to look to the legislature to see what the legislature has said about waiving immunity, but if the legislature hasn't said anything, I guess we're going to have to make a decision and decide and adopt some judicial rules about this until the legislature will make a decision on it, basically. And so they say, in cases, they'll talk about, well, we've discussed the possibility of waiver, even absent legislative waiver of immunity. So again, it's a balance between the courts saying, well, the legislature hasn't ruled on it, but there hasn't passed any laws on it, but we think there's this, whether or not there's waiver of immunity. And so they look at that, they say there's a tension between the concept of a governmental entity waiving its immunity from suit, but they're talking about action independent from the legislature's waiving immunity and the principle that only the legislature can waive immunity. So again, they're saying, well, we've created this rule where a party can waive their immunity by getting into litigation, but the legislature hasn't, that the legislature hasn't said anything about waiving immunity. And so we'll talk about that, recognizing that sovereign immunity is a common law doctrine, but have not foreclosed the possibility that the judiciary may modify or abrogate such immunity by modifying the common law. So this is still them talking about, well, we've had to do it, we'll go in and make these changes to the rules judicially. And then literally said, the Texas Supreme Court noted that the judicial abolition of immunity, meaning the judicial action to waive immunity or take away immunity, may be necessary to prompt the legislature to do something about it. So they're saying, well, look, if we come up with a court decision that says, yes, the state or this governmental entity has waived immunity, or we're going to adopt this rule about waiver of immunity, if maybe then if the legislature doesn't like it or people complain to the legislature, they'll go do something about it, pass a law that establishes the rules about when immunity can be waived or not. So therefore, it remains the judiciary's responsibility to define the boundaries of the common law doctrine and to determine under what circumstances sovereign immunity exists in the first instance. Now, what we're leading to is the legislature did then, or has over the years, in fact, adopted statutes and laws that did waive immunity. We're going to talk about those. And so the first one is, this is not the subject that we're here to talk about today, but it's been a long history of waiver of immunity for certain tort claims. This is negligence claims. It's not contract law, but this is the other big body of law of civil liability called tort claims. And you all have probably heard about the Texas Tort Claims Act. And that law has been around for many, many years. And it was a law that the legislature passed saying that under these defined circumstances, state governmental entities, and there's a federal version of that law too, but this is in Texas, that state governmental entities, we're going to waive immunity from suit for certain types of claims. And it becomes this, this challenge to apply and adopt that statute that they passed. So this is the actual law is the Texas Civil Practice and Remedies Code, Chapter 101. That is the Texas Tort Claims Act. And what it says is that as to state governmental entities, the Act waives immunity for personal for property damage, excuse me, so it's property damage, personal injury, and death. Those are the three types of things, and that's a typical tort claim, like a negligence. Imagine a car accident. We'll talk about that in a minute here. But a car accident where there's either property damage to the vehicle, personal injury to the person driving the car or in the car, or death to that person or persons. Now, and it's very limited in what the waiver of immunity is for. It's arising from the operation or use of a motor-driven vehicle or motor-driven equipment, or caused by a condition or use of tangible, personal, or real property. So those definitions are, this is the universe of what gets waived for governmental entities. What can you sue a governmental entity for? So, for example, if a vehicle from the city utilities department is driving down the road and hits you in a car accident, the city can be sued for that. They can be sued for personal injury or property damage arising from the operation or use of a motor-driven vehicle or motor-driven equipment. We'll talk about that in a minute. Or caused by a condition or use of tangible, personal, or real property. Now, what this means is two different things. Personal, by the use of personal property or real property. So there were a lot of cases out there that used to talk about there's these hospitals that are run by the state, that are owned by the state. VA hospitals are ones that are run by the federal government. They have a similar statute to this again. But they're hospitals that are owned by the state. And I can't think that you all here in Houston, one off the top of my head, but that is a state. Well, you have MD Anderson, for example, I think is owned by or if it's not the UT system, it's involved. It's a governmental entity. And so you'll get these lawsuits that talk about, well, was a person injured there? As a general rule, you would not be able to sue the doctors of MD Anderson for just medical negligence if they did something wrong and just medical malpractice. But if they were using some personal equipment, some type of, not an x-ray machine, but some sort of device that they were using at the time, you get these lawsuits that interpret well, was this medical injury at this hospital caused by the use of tangible property, of personal property? And that would be some kind of device or something they were using or equipment or something like that. And then you get into the real property of that's just the premises, what we call premises liability cases, a lot of slip and fall cases, that type of thing, of if somebody came into this building and tripped on a tear in the carpet and fell, could they sue the Harris County Department of Education for that? And the Harris County Department of Education being a branch of a governmental entity. And the answer to that is generally yes, because it's real property. They have certain standards for that. But and then highway accidents, there are certain rules, specific rules about that. But anyway, so this was generally a waiver of immunity, meaning you could sue state governmental entities for these types of things. Now, except for, specifically for us, for school districts, and this is something I've had to actually almost beat into some people's heads at school districts because they find it hard to believe. But the only thing that is waived for school districts out of all of this, you could strike through all of this except for motor vehicles. So the only thing that school districts can be sued for in tort, for any type of accident that happens, injury, your students get injured, football games, they're getting injured, they're concussions, fights breaking out between students, and are you liable in negligence? Now I'll make a distinction here in a second, but we're talking about tort claims. We're not talking about people. There are claims you can have against governmental entities that come out of constitutional rights. Those are constitutional violations about different things. That this is specifically a waiver of tort claims, and there's a difference. So again, tort claims are accidents, things like that. There's constitutional torts or deprivation of a property interest or violation of First Amendment rights and things like that. There's never been governmental immunity for violation of the constitutional rights of citizens. I mean, that's the whole point, is actually governments are the only ones that can be liable for violation of constitutional rights, because individuals can't be sued for that. I mean, you can't sue me for violating your First Amendment rights. People use that term a lot and misuse it and say that you're violating my constitutional rights, but unless you're the government, you can't violate the constitutional rights. But for torts, the only thing that school districts can be sued for is use of motor vehicles. So that's why you have bus accident cases, and again, any employee driving a car in the course and scope of their employment and having an accident, the school district could be sued for that, and the school district employee. Yes?
Motor-driven equipment.
No, because my next point is a lawnmower a motor vehicle? And if Mr. Amesqua is still here, and if his memory goes back far enough, he will remember there was a time where he asked me, John, we had an incident where our guys were mowing some grass over here, and a rock shot out and hit somebody's windshield in the parking lot and broke their windshield, and now they're coming to us asking us to pay for their broken windshield. Are we allowed do we have liability for that? Can we do it? And yeah, the answer was no. You're shaking your head here. The answer was no. But because the question was, it is only motor vehicles, it's not a motor-driven equipment. Literally, this is the exact wording of the statute. Except as to motor vehicles, this chapter does not apply to school district or junior college. So the question was, is a lawnmower a motor vehicle? And this is what you have lawyers for, is to have to research the question of, and there are cases out there that talk about, well, what if it's a riding mower? Now, is that a motor vehicle? I don't know, you're sitting in it, and you're driving it around. I don't know, maybe you drove it down the street, I don't know. But the short answer was no, that it does not. There are actually cases out there that say lawnmowers are not motor vehicles, so therefore that technically school districts would not have liability for breaking somebody's windshield. And so if they came to you and because of a rock that got shot out of a lawnmower, and so when they come to you and say, will you please pay for this? And you say, sorry, but we are not liable for that. We don't have any obligation to pay you. So if we voluntarily pay you, that's what? A gift of public funds, that's right. It's becoming my other favorite topic because I've got a lot of issues dealing with that lately.
How about a forklift?
I have not researched a forklift, but forklift's getting a lot closer. I mean, that's you know, that is intended to be driven around now. But I think the distinction, I don't remember, if I knew you were going to be that interested in it, I could have brought all the research I had done for that over the years. But I believe it has to, the intent was, that the courts talk about that the intent was it has to be driven out on the roads. And so probably a forklift would not apply to that either, because the intention wasn't to drive it around on the roads. But so that is the idea of that. That's this classic example of the legislature. Remember, there was this talk about the court saying, well, gee, we wish the legislature would do this because we think it's their responsibility, but if the legislature doesn't do anything, we have to go ahead and adopt these rules and everything. But then the legislature many years ago came up with this Texas Tort Claims Act. They passed this law, and then it becomes, well, the courts still have to deal with interpreting it, talking about like on this the lawnmower issue. You still have to talk about how you interpret the statute, but this is one example of the waiver of immunity. Okay, so now we're on to our main topic of waiver of contractual immunity. So we're going to walk through this because although that sounds obvious, a public school district is a local governmental entity, is because we're now going to lead into the language of this statute that waives immunity for contract claims if you meet the requirements of the statute. But so number one is the statute applies to local governmental entities. The law says a public school district, it is defined in the statute as a local governmental entity. Number two, as a local governmental entity, a school district has immunity from suit unless its immunity is waived. The general rule is you have immunity unless it's waived. So the legislature has waived a local governmental entity's immunity from suit in certain breach of contract claims. And that law is this, starting with section 271.151 and a couple of sections after that of the Texas Local Government Code, with this first section that is titled Adjudication of Claims Arising Under Written Contracts with Local Governmental Entities. I'll tell you, it's funny, write down or type adjudication, and you feel like you're typing wrong. There's too many letters in there when you type it. It's kind of weird because, I don't know, there's something about that D and the J there next to each other. Personal comment. So, with the section 271.152 this is really the basic rule that we're dealing with is, now, with contracts, similar to the Tort Claims Act, this statute waives immunity, and it says a local governmental entity, which a school district is included, that is authorized by statute or the Constitution to enter into a contract, which school districts generally are, and that enters into a contract subject to this chapter. That's going to be defined. You're going to see that. A contract subject to this chapter waives sovereign immunity to suit for the purpose of adjudicating a claim for breach of the contract. So you waive immunity from suit about, did you breach that contract or not, subject to the terms and conditions of this subchapter. Okay, so we move on to, well then, what is a contract under this statute? What falls under this statute? And that it's defined. This is literally, it says a contract subject to this subchapter means, and we're going to walk through this because it is a written contract, that's going to be important, stating the essential terms of the agreement for providing goods or services. That's important. It has to be a contract for providing goods and services, or services, to the local governmental entity. And it's, by the way, it's providing goods or services to the local governmental entity. And so again, that's one distinction is when you get into the details of the statute is, if for some reason the school district entered into a contract where it agreed to be the provider of the services to somebody else, and then the school district decided, no, you know what, for whatever reason we're not going to do it, or we need to get out of it, or some dispute arises, this doesn't apply because it has to be for providing goods or services to the local governmental entity, and that is properly executed on behalf of the local governmental entity. Or, now, this is the section, we're going to get into the details of this provision, because this next one is, you tell me if you've ever, this one is just kind of, I think the legislature, some particular representative, somebody was thinking about something that his constituents had an issue with, because it's for this other category, a written contract including right of first refusal regarding sale or delivery of not less than 1,000 acre-feet of reclaimed water by a local governmental entity intended for industrial use. That seems awful specific to me, and the legislature does this more often than you would think. They put in these, some particular representative or legislator will put in, hey, this is particularly for my constituent, I have this big business or something in my district, and I want to put this language in here. So really, this is the law we're talking about. I mean, it includes this other thing that you waive immunity for, but this is a particular subset there. Okay, so what is a contract under the statute? Well, number one, it must be a written contract. There was a case that interpreted this that talked about that a series of procurement-related documents between the school district and the vendor did not constitute a written contract even with court action. The vendor what the facts were of that case was there was a request for proposals, let's say, the vendor responded, submitted. So you think about it, there was an offer, the district, under contract law, theoretically, it would be, well, the district said, hey, do you want to provide some goods to me? That's like an offer. The other side says, yes, I do. Here's my proposal of, I want to do it for whatever, $1 per pencil. And then the school district actually, it took it to the board, and the board voted on it and said, yes, we're going to award the contract to this vendor. So you say, hey, we have an offer, an acceptance of the offer under general contract law, civil contract law. That's enough to be a binding contract. Even without, you don't have to write it up after that and create a formal written contract. So in civil law, with not school districts, that would be a binding contract right there. But was it a written contract for a governmental entity for the school district to waive its immunity? The court said no, it was not, because it was not a contract, a written contract that incorporated the essential terms of the agreement. Even though the board had taken board action, they had not signed the contract. So, you would know, for hopefully you won't have that situation come up very often, but even if you go through all the procurement process, the board votes on it and awards the contract, that is not binding in the sense that if the district changes its mind, administration comes back and says, you know what, we decided we need to change that for some reason, the board then comes back in a later vote and says, okay, we're rescinding our action to award the contract, then if the vendor sues for that, well then ultimately, it wouldn't be a good situation to be sued or whatever, but you should be able to have that the lawsuit dismissed because you didn't waive your immunity, and that the district would have immunity from suit saying, look, I'm sorry, you can't sue us for that. Now, and by the way, keep that example in mind that I talked about here of this process that happened that didn't quite enter into a written contract. There's some other legal theories I'll talk to you about that I've always cautioned clients about saying, well, when you have the vendor, the board votes to award the contract, but then the written contract isn't signed or whatever, but the vendor starts performing under the contract. Let's say it's a construction contract, and you let the contractor go out and start to mobilize and get stuff done. That I've seen that more than once, where the contractor says, well, I'm going to, you know, the board has voted on it, we're working on drafting the contract, but I'm going to go ahead and start ordering and getting my people together and getting my stuff out to the site or whatever. Maybe I won't start building. But then, and we'll talk about these legal theories in a second, but then if the board says, no, you know what, we changed our mind, we're rescinding the action, we're going to do something else, and the contractor says, hey, wait a minute, I incurred actual cost of mobilizing, getting stuff together, I ordered some materials, and you say, well, but we didn't have a written contract. Well, I know, but the board voted. I was there when the board voted. They said I got the contract, so I went ahead and started acting on it. There's some legal theories for that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But so it must be a written contract. It can't be verbal. Number two, it must be, as I said a minute ago, for providing goods or services to the local governmental entity. And so for another example in a case in Texas was that there was a written contract, so it met that requirement, but it was not for the procurement of goods and services. It was for the purchase of property. It was a written contract, what's called an earnest money contract, for the purchase of some real property. And the district had signed this earnest money contract, but then for whatever reason did not go through with the sale. And the seller came back and said, well, wait a minute, we had an agreement. You were going to buy my property. We have a written contract. I'm going to sue you for that written contract. The response to that was, well, sorry, it does not fall under this statute that we're talking about. This is the only statute in Texas that waives immunity for breach of contract. So if it is a breach of contract that is not this type of contract, the governmental entity is immune from liability and could not be sued for that. So the answer was here, well, sorry, seller, I mean, you know, it's a governmental entity and you run the risk that the governmental entity has immunity from suit. So that's another example of that it's very specific. It's not just, hey, well, there's some statute out there and there's a general idea that you're waiving immunity for all contract issues. No, it has to fall under the specifics. Okay, and then the contract has to be executed on behalf of the local governmental entity. So I don't, theoretically, if there was some situation where the contract, there's not a case that I've seen on this yet, but where the contract was prepared, written, and the vendor signs it and sends it back, until it's signed on behalf of the governmental entity, it is not binding. And by the way, that would also be very important, because I've seen some issues here in the past few years about, say you have campuses, that a campus principal who's signing an agreement with the or a cheerleader sponsor who signs an order for some cheerleading uniforms, or the campus principal signs a contract for providing, you know, I don't know, book covers or something like that, and they're doing this at the campus level, whether or not that's in compliance with your procurement policies or not, but let's say they do it, and then they don't get paid, and the vendor comes and says, hey, your district ordered this, your principal had authority to order, or arguably they claim had authority to order this. Well, you'd ask them, well, okay, well, show me the written contract that is executed on behalf of the local governmental entity, meaning it's executed on behalf of the board of trustees, because if we go back there a few steps, it has to be signed on behalf of the board. So my argument would be, well, if it's not, if this was basically a rogue principal, or again, a sponsor of any club or cheerleader, group or whatever that didn't pay for something, and you're getting threatening letters, it's no, we're still immune, because that person, if they didn't do it in compliance with our procurement rules that are approved by the board, or could somehow have the district be held responsible for it, well, then the district is still immune. So, okay, now here's the type of claim that I was talking about before, that you could get. This is the type of claim that I've seen threatened, and there was a lot of case law on this until it started to get clarified more recently here. But again, using that example about the construction contractor, that the contract, there's an RFQ that goes out, the contract is actually awarded by the board, but so the successful respondent, the vendor, but the contract is not signed yet, and the contractor goes out and starts performing under the contract, or claims that he was, and then the decision is changed and says, hey, I incurred $10,000, you have to pay me for that because I spent money out of my pocket in reliance on the board's action. there are these claims under Texas law called quasi-contractual claims. And they include things like things called promissory estoppel, quantum merit, unjust enrichment. And they're quasi-contract because they're claims that arise in the situation of not having a final written contract between the parties. They're actually extra-contractual, where they say, well, we didn't have a written contract, but in civil law between private parties, you can have a situation where they say, well, I relied on you, and I thought we had a contract, and I relied on your representations, so that a sort of quasi-contractual obligations and relationship existed. So we're going to use the example of lawnmowers again, one of my favorite topics. So in a situation of, let's say, for example, just to drive the point home, you're at your house, and you're sitting on your front porch drinking a lemonade in the summer, and somebody pulls up and waves to you and gets out and starts mowing your yard. And you watch him, you sit there and wave, you're very friendly, oh, hi, yeah, good to see you again. And he comes out, he mows your yard, and then he finishes, spends 2 or 3 hours doing it, does a great job, and everything, comes to you and says, okay, that's going to be $50. And you say, well, I'm not going to pay you. I didn't ask you to come to come mow my yard. He said, well, wait a minute. What are you talking about? I waved to you. I thought, aren't you Frank? No, Frank's next door, and you mowed my yard by mistake. But in that situation, although there was no contract, there might not have been an actual meeting of the minds. It was not the property owner saying, yes, I will agree to pay you $50 if you mow my yard, and the vendor says, okay, yes, I'll agree to mow your yard if you pay me $50. So there's an actual meeting of the minds and offer and acceptance and all that of contract law. There may not have been all that, but under civil law with private parties, you can have liability for that. If I were the lawnmower vendor, I could sue you if you were the homeowner and say, well, you can't sit there and watch me do it and tell me you're not going to pay me. I mean, particularly, I can't just go do it surreptitiously behind your back and then expect you to pay me. There are these theories about, for example, in that case, that would be the homeowner was unjustly enriched. You had this work performed, his property was the better for it, it got improved because it looks nice now, and so that is a claim that there would be quasi-contractual liability for. Now, this, and again, although these claims can be similar to breach of contract claims, they are barred by governmental immunity because there was no written contract. And we've been through the requirements of the statute now that there was no written contract for it, it was not signed, and there was an issue. This was an issue under Texas law about whether or not, I've advised, and I still think it's the best practice of school districts, do not allow your vendors or your contractors to begin performance under the contract until you have the signed contract, because you could still get this type of claim and you don't want to have to argue about it. But the one that comes to mind that recently was, we're struggling with the copier service, copy machines, and the service provider, the vendor, was just, it was coming down to they were switching out the machines from the previous company because they had awarded the contract to a new company, and they were under deadlines to get the machines, the new machines in. They were going to start delivering them, but we hadn't finished negotiating the contract because there were some issues, and we were dealing with lawyers and people from I don't know where, and they were having to talk to each other and negotiate even amongst themselves about what changes they could allow to the contract or not. And going through all that, but the district was under pressure with the vendor saying, look, you need to get the machines in here because we can't have our campuses and people not having copy machines. And so, but you're like, look, if they start putting in machines and we don't get this contract finished, well then we're going to potentially have this problem. But the law is now pretty clear that you would not have liability even if they say, if you wanted to, if you said, well, look, we're not going to pay you for having your machines here if we don't have a contract, we'll just kick you back out even if we used them for a month. That if there was not a written contract for it that was signed on behalf of the district, then you probably wouldn't have to pay for that. So, waiver of claims, this is another category. Okay. There's a type of claim for a declaratory judgment, where if there's a statute called the Uniform Declaratory Judgment Act that says that essentially you could sue somebody to have your rights under written documents declared or interpreted. So you're not suing somebody for money damages. You're not necessarily. You're not. So if there's a contract, you might not be suing somebody. And this is between private parties in general, or even in governmental entities. But if you sue them, it's one thing to say, well, we're suing to have for a declaration under the Uniform Declaratory Judgment Act to have this contract, the rights of the parties declared, or have it declared whether or not the contract is a binding contract or not. And it can be a little confusing because you think, well, what's the difference between that and just a breach of contract? If you're suing somebody for a breach of contract and pay me money for a breach of contract, but there is this other type of claim where you could just sue to say, well, we just want the court to declare whether or not a contract actually exists. One way this statute was used a lot is to declare whether or not the governmental entity properly followed procurement laws, and to declare that they're not following procurement laws correctly or the procedures correctly, and that they did something in awarding a contract improperly, and you have your bidder who didn't get the contract awarded to him say, no, I'm going to file a lawsuit that says that to declare under the Uniform Declaratory Judgment Act, to declare that you didn't follow the procedures properly or follow the law properly. And so but there's a distinction between that. The court said that, well, if you're just suing to require state officials to comply with statutory or constitutional provisions, that's not barred by sovereign immunity. So if you're just filing a declaratory judgment lawsuit to have the court declare that the governmental entity has to follow statutory or constitutional provisions, well, that would not be barred by governmental immunity. But that's a difference between, so somebody could file a lawsuit and say, well, again, school district, you have to comply with the statutes that say for competitive procurement and awards of contracts. As long as they don't sue for, and by the way, on that specific awarding of a contract, you didn't award it to me, and so I want you to give me $100,000 because you should have awarded me the contract and you didn't, you gave it to the other company and I lost $100,000. That next part of it saying, well, I want $100,000, that would be barred by governmental immunity. But the part of, I just want the court to declare that you're not following the proper procedures and tell you to follow proper procedures in the future, that would not be barred by governmental immunity. So that's what that's saying. And again, that because they were saying that if it's against the state officials and you're telling the employees, basically, somebody like you all, that you're telling the officials to comply with the laws, that even though those are kind of suits against the state for practical purposes, that they can't be brought against the state, which retains immunity, but must be brought against the state actors in their official capacity, so that they end up wording the lawsuit as being against the employees, the staff, people like you all, for not following the procedures, even though they still can't get money for it. They're just asking for interpretation of the law that the courts have kind of figured out a way to allow that to happen. So that the summary is the case is seeking a declaration that state officers acted without legal or statutory authority, which is what we've been talking about, and seeking to force or compel the state actors to act in conformance with the laws are not barred by governmental immunity. So that's a type of lawsuit that's not barred by governmental immunity, but the other actions brought under the Declaratory Judgment Act are barred by that. So coming down specifically to procurement laws. This is what I was saying earlier. This was a development that came down about 10 years ago where there was clarification about this. Again, could an unsuccessful bidder sue to say, hey, you should have awarded me the contract. You didn't. You were wrong. You owe me the $100,000 profit that I would have made from that contract. No. You can't, that the state procurement laws, first of all, don't create what they call a private right of action. So it wasn't for one company to say, well, because you violated the procurement laws, you owe me money. They said, no, you can't do that. And, but they do say that again, talking about that under this Declaratory Judgment Act, you could sue to force the governmental entity to comply with the law in the future, and that would be in the nature of an injunction, and you might be able to recover attorney's fees. But I added here, but even this is probably now barred by immunity, because even the award of attorney's fees, there's more recent cases where they're coming out and saying, look, this statute that says we're waiving immunity only for these contractual claims, that doesn't even, allow this thing about these injunctions and this other stuff. So there is an issue even, you know, I would make an argument if I had to and was in litigation that even that is barred by immunity now and not waived. So, okay, so we've talked about, well, what types of claims can you make under this statute that waives contractual immunity? What kind of claims can you make? But now we've talked about that, and now the question is, well, okay, if you can bring a claim, if it's not barred by immunity, because this statute says you can sue the school district for this type of breach of contract claim, well, what kind of money can you get out of it? What damages can you sue for? So this has to do with the topic of money awarded. What damages can you get? Now, I'll say as background that the reason it was important for the legislature to say this about saying, well, okay, well, not only in Section 1, here are the types of claims you can sue for and circumstances under which the government can be sued, but number 2, what damages can you recover? Because for breach of contract, in just the general civil law, and again, among private parties, if you sue for breach of contract, there's all sorts of damages claims that you can try to make. So just for example, let's say it's a construction contractor, and it's just me, and he's doing a project for my personal business. And the contractor, we have a contract, and I terminate the contract because I think he did something wrong, the company did something wrong, and the company says, no, we didn't do anything wrong. And if the contractor in a private lawsuit could try to make the claim that not only, well, Kazen, when I was going to do this contract for your company and build this building for you, I was planning to make $100,000 in profit for your building. But in addition to that, because you canceled the contract, now I didn't get that $100,000. I couldn't pay my employees. That it affected my ability to perform other contracts, and all of that went to hell in a handbasket. And so I lost $1 million in contracts, and my business is in bankruptcy now. So you owe me $10 million because you put my whole business in the toilet. That's all called incidental and consequential damages, and it's this big complicated thing under Texas civil law. You could make those types of claims. But so that's why it's important. So what the statute says is that this is what you can recover. These are the elements. Number 1, the balance due and owed by the governmental entity under the contract, including amounts that have been increased for the increased cost of work to perform as a direct result of delays or acceleration. But the general thing is here, if there's a balance due and owed. The whole purpose, the primary purpose of this contract was, now the theme is, it was a contract because somebody was going to provide goods or services. And what the legislature wanted to do is, district, if you owe somebody money for a good or a service they provided, you need to pay it, and they can sue you for it. So what can they sue you for? Well, they can sue you for the unpaid balance that's due and owing. That's number 1. Number 2, if there were change orders or additional work the contractor directed to perform in connection with the contract. And number 3, interest allowed by law. And it goes on. That you may not include consequential damages. That was the type of thing that I was talking about before. Now, this says except as expressly allowed under this other subsection. I didn't even include that other subsection, except A1. They say except that if there was increased cost to perform the work as a result of delays or acceleration. So they're saying other than that, you cannot sue for consequential damages. You cannot sue for exemplary damages. Exemplary damages is this other category of, well, hey, not only did you breach the contract and you owe us $10,000 for breaching the contract, but your conduct was so bad and egregious that to punish you, you can be awarded additional exemplary, what's it called, exemplary damages that they say you cannot. So these are damages that you cannot record it, that it may not include consequential damages, exemplary damages, damages for unabsorbed home office overhead, which is kind of seems strange, specific thing to include in there. But you cannot include that, because I guess people were claiming that. Okay, and this is wrapping it up, but this is towards the end. These are just there's some kind of miscellaneous provisions that were included at the end of the statute. We've covered the meat of the statute, but finally, it just throws in here that if your written contract for goods and services, it was written and it was signed and everything, if it had an arbitration provision in there, the arbitration provision is enforceable. They did specifically say that. Or mediation. If you have some kind of alternative dispute resolution process in your contract, that is enforceable. That's not waived by immunity And so they specifically said that alternative dispute resolution about before bringing a suit or an arbitration proceeding, that if it's incorporated by reference, it is enforceable. And so if you have that, I've talked about that before in presentations about contract provisions. I generally advise school districts that you don't need, it's really not in your best interest to have the arbitration provision, because you generally shouldn't be afraid of going into court and having a jury or a judge lean in your favor. But if you do have it, it is enforceable. And so that brings us to the end of the presentation. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, in what circumstances would you recommend to your client to waive immunity?
I would tell them, unless you can give me, we sit down and talk about some very specific reason, I would never advise it. I mean, there's just no reason to. You have, the biggie, let's say you've got a contract for computers with Microsoft. They might have a provision in there that says that you waive any and all claims and you waive immunity or something like that. And that just, is not a good idea. It gets very difficult to say, well, we'll limit it because they're trying to use their buying leverage or selling leverage to do something, but the general rule is never, unless you were just really forced to do it because of the circumstances of the services you needed or the goods that you needed. It's just why. I mean, it's such a great benefit. I mean, I'll tell you all, I represent private schools and religious schools, Catholic schools, and they're, as a public school system, you all are in such a stronger position for this immunity from suit that you get because you're a governmental entity. Representing private schools is scary because the things they can get sued for just almost anything having to do with their students or procurement or anything is pretty frightening when you think about that. And the protections that you all are given by law is really helpful, really let you run your district as a business and provide the services, the educational services, without having to look over your shoulder on every decision and get worried about getting sued. All right. Well, thank you very much.
All right. I'm Nick Long from Gallagher. We are the benefits consultant for TASB. We also in the room have Cole Henschel from TASB and Bob Tracy from Gallagher as well. These rooms are around, kind of changes. So this presentation is right at about 3.5 hours long, so just settle in. I'm just kidding. I'll keep it to relatively short. Nobody needs a bunch of voluntary benefits information on a Friday. So it's just kind of a basic overview of what voluntary benefits are, why they're important, and why school districts are increasingly looking at them to help solve some of their problems. So we're going to cover the what, why, how, and who of voluntary benefits. So first things first, voluntary benefits are defined as the insurance and financial products which employees pay the majority of the cost for. Some districts cover some of them. Some of the larger districts generally cover maybe the dental or the disability or a portion or the life insurance, different things like that. It varies from case to case. So really they break down into 4 distinct kinds. You have the ancillary products. Those are the ones that everybody thinks about, the big main level benefits, the worksite stuff, the non-traditional, and finally the financial. So we're going to break right into it, and the ancillary ones are the big hitters. It's the dental, it's the disability, life insurance, vision, the stuff that everybody kind of expects and really wants to get when they go to a job. These are the ones that people really evaluate. What's the contribution for the dental look like? What's the contribution for the disability? It can be employer paid or voluntary, and there's different ways and different reasons why you might choose to do that. If they're employer paid, generally the price is much less than if they're voluntary. And that's just a basic principle of insurance that obviously if you elect a voluntary disability plan, probably a greater chance that you're going to go out on disability. Maybe you're planning, especially in school districts, you have a high percentage of women, especially childbearing age. So the disability rates go up a little bit if it's voluntary. However, TASB has plans that you can cover them much less expensive if you use an employer-paid plan. These are very critical for helping to attract and retain employees. The worksite plans. These are The Duck, I mean, Workstar, Aflac, they spend tons of money advertising. If you've ever seen, you go on to Yahoo Finance and look up the amount of money Aflac makes. They make gobs of cash. And the reason is because people love these benefits, because every time they turn on television, there's another advertisement from the cute duck trying to make them think that they need these things. The plans generally run at a loss ratio of about 20% to 25%. So the insurance companies are making 70, 80 cents on the dollar. That affords a lot of prime time advertising. So there's not a whole lot of value to these things unless you really spend some time making sure you can find easy to use, valuable products with loose underwriting standards. And then if you set it up correctly and give easy to understand benefits, simple flat benefit amounts, there can be some value. But if a plan gets really complicated, you get $200 for this, you get $25 for that, people just don't use it and they'll never claim, so they'll never pay, so the insurance company makes a ton of money. The non-traditional benefits, these are the things that for years only very large companies really offer to their employees. It's the employer, payroll deducted, home and auto, pet insurance, identity theft, legal insurance, and these things can be either offered directly at the school district, or it can be, they go onto a separate website and go do that. There is some value to these things. I wouldn't say there's a terrible need for them. Dog insurance is not something that I think most people need, but I will say we recently implemented it in Austin ISD, a large school district, and we had an incredible amount of participation. I mean, we were about 15% of the people elected pet insurance in some way or another, which I found astonishing. But, it's Austin, and people really love their dogs. You can pretty much take your dog into anywhere with you. So, it might be something that you couldn't do otherwise. We had, for kind of a funny story, the school district actually increased their contribution to their benefit plan and decreased the deductible down to $300. And so and that's a pretty low deductible this day and age. So at the end, when we did the employee satisfaction survey, the school board kicking in this extra money and lowering the deductible took second to offering pet insurance as the number one thing that changed in the benefit plan last year. So that just goes to show that sometimes it's not just the amount of money you throw at a plan. Maybe some people appreciate different things. And so, I guess cat insurance is important. These, I think, are often underlooked, and it's the 403Bs, the 457s, the financial products. So if you look at overall participation in products, you'll see that a lot of teachers do participate in a 437 or 403B. However, they're usually severely underfunding what they should be. A lot of people do it and kind of check the box. So they'll say, okay, I'm putting in $50 a month. I'm good. I'm all saved up. Well, in reality, they're probably viciously under-saving and not exactly planning. These products can also be great for future planning, and we use them as vehicles for that. So when you really sit down and think about it, what you need to have is a 437 that doesn't just allow people to save money. It helps them from planning what they're going to get from TRS, what they need to supplement that and keep their current, the current lifestyle intact, and help them work through all those issues. I have a mother-in-law that works for the school district here in Region 4, and me being the expert, then she brought all the TRS stuff to me and sat down and said, all right, tell me what to do. And I said, oh man, this is incredibly complicated. So you sit down and you start really digging into it, and start going through all these things, and there's a lot of moving parts. And that's when you can really use the voluntary benefits to get people to help your employees. It's a way to pay for kind of customized care. So if you look at the chart, it kind of breaks down the participation versus the cost. And you'll see the financial benefits, high in participation, low in cost. So in this way, you have a lot of people participating, but maybe not enough, but a lot of people aren't putting enough money away in those financial products. The non-traditional benefits, that's the pet insurance, stuff like that. Now a lot of people participate, but they really don't cost that much. The ancillary benefits, the big mainline stuff, those have the high highest, a good level of participation, but they do cost the most, but they are the most valuable. People really get a lot out of them. Life insurance, disability insurance, definitely valuable things to have. So why go through, or why care about this? I'm sure most of you, or if not all of you, have probably a robust voluntary offering right now. I'm sure you have all the products. And having all the products is good, but you may not have a unified strategy of why you're offering those products, or what those, are those products really what should be offered, or is it just kind of checking a box? So school districts obviously do not have just a ton of money. And it's going to be very hard for you to go out there and compete with Exxon, or go try to hire people with just big lavish pay increases and gold-plated medical plans. Probably is not going to happen in the day and age that we're sitting in. The one thing you can compete with is that you have the ability to kind of customize these voluntary plans to make it something that could be of value. It helps level the playing field a little bit and helps reduce the taxable income that people have and offer some different things. The other great advantage these plans are, they can help supplement your administrative systems. So oftentimes, going out and getting an HRIS system is very expensive. You're talking cost $7 to $10 per employee per month for a very good one. But if you offer these voluntary plans, oftentimes you can get all that advanced system for no or severely reduced cost. So that means a system that could enroll directly into your health plan, enroll directly into TRS, a single unified system for ads, terms, deletions, tracking, healthcare reform tracking, which is increasingly becoming what I spend most of my time on, tracking for substitutes. All these things can be integrated into the voluntary benefit system and paid for with the voluntary benefits. So essentially, companies will severely discount or give away free systems which would cost a whole lot if you had to buy them on the open market. But also, you're able to just improve the overall package for the employees. It also helps fill the gaps. I'm sure some of you have your own health plans. A lot of you are probably on TRS. And as I think we know, the TRS plans leave something to be desired, to say the least. These plans, especially some of the worksite plans, could be paired and designed with the high deductible plans to help cover and eat up some of that risk. So in a high deductible plan, you obviously cannot have first dollar coverage. However, indemnity plans do not count as first dollar coverage. So what some people do is essentially you got the HD1 out there, and you supplement that plan with an accident plan. So if you were to get in a car accident, it would pay you a lump sum of $10,000. That would be enough then to cover the deductible, cover the out-of-pocket max, and supplement some of those costs. So these indemnity plans can act as kind of bridges into the TRS plans. You of course have the payroll tax savings, which that would be for all parties involved in the transaction. And then the real part is the increased engagement. So oftentimes you can use this as a way to communicate the benefits, tell everybody what's going on, tell them about how TRS is going, and answer the medical questions that simply you probably don't have staff for right now. I doubt, most of you are the finance officers out there, and I doubt your budgets have lavish HR teams that can go out and talk to everybody. I think I'm dead. No, I'm here. Okay, so they help you afford more boots on the ground to help communicate the changes and get the employees engaged and start kind of moving the district in a different direction. So the how, okay, so you have all this stuff. And generally, the hardest thing to do is to change. We've had the same plans for 10 years. We've got a local guy that handles it. It all seems fine. Well, it may not be. And so what you can do is how to implement these things. There's several different ways. There's traditional, just RFP process. You go out, you hire a fancy consultant to do all this work and put all that together. We come back and rank everything, show you what's out there, talk about it, evaluate it, go through this whole process. That is, of course, costly. I'm not, we aren't free, guys like Bob and I, but so that there's cost there, there's effort, time. There's also other ways. There's interlocals. There's TASB interlocal, there's Region 4, there's a variety of other things out there. So sometimes what I would suggest before going in and launching some massive RFP process is evaluate kind of the interlocals that are already out there first. And then if you see that maybe that doesn't meet our needs, they kind of default to doing your own RFP process. So when you're starting this process, the first thing I would probably recommend is benchmark. Find out what everybody else is doing. So, how do our plans look? How do we really compare to everybody out there? Identify your competitor districts both in the area and then like-sized districts across the state, and get kind of the benchmarks for that. There's a variety of different ways to get that. Of course, you spend a lot of time surfing the internet and looking up everybody's benefit plan. Or TASB actually has a benefit benchmarking report of every other school district, so they benchmark every school district in Texas already. It's very easy and searchable by size, by region, by if you're in TRS, if not in TRS. So you can really build custom reports and see what everybody else is doing and kind of know better on what you think they need to go from there. And then the most crucial thing I can recommend is just simply leave enough time. Start this process very early. Start it so early that you think it's too early, and then kind of build from there. First part of the process, identify what you need, and then go get it. And in the best practices side, hiring a consultant. That's kind of weird that of course the consultant who gets hired to do these things would recommend you doing that. It's trying to get job security here, but there's a variety of different ways of going about it. And then create a committee, because what's good for one section of employees may not be good for everybody else. So I recommend getting a broad-based committee to talk to find out their thoughts, people from every department, people from every school, and get broad buy-in, because most of these benefits are paid by employee money. So you want the employees to feel good about what they're being offered, and the employees really to tell you what they want. And then the roles and responsibility. So keep harping on it. Leaving time is the most important thing. Creating the broad committee, and then considering overall value, not just price. So don't buy on price on these products. They're best if you try to evaluate what are we looking for and how can we solve it using these things. And then if they're a little bit more, kind of weigh that for what you're getting. All right, so I'm going to skip to the very end and just go to the questions and the closing. So voluntary employee benefits are a valuable, low to no cost way of offering something to their employees. I mean, it's been kind of years of very low pay raises, and at the same time the pay raises were low, the health insurance was getting more expensive. So they've been being squeezed on their wallets, and this is a way that the district can offer something that could potentially either put money back in their pocket or provide more financial security without the district having to come out of pocket for a lot of money. These things definitely increase employee engagement, and they increase overall satisfaction. So they can be valuable when deployed correctly. You guys have any questions? I know I was talking over your lunch, and it wasn't very exciting, but anybody? All right.